The story begins in Japan, inside a man's house, where he was busy preparing his airsoft equipment. He opened the door and headed out with purpose. His name was Koga Daisuke, a 40-year-old ordinary salaryman whose greatest passion outside of work was survival games. As he was walking, he came across a sign written in letters he could not read or recognize. The sign was actually a warning about dangerous magical beasts in the area, though Daisuke had no way of knowing that. He was, in a way that he himself found difficult to fully process or accept, wandering into another world through his closet. This place was filled with animals and plants he had never encountered before, and the strangeness of it surprised him every single time he arrived. He had more or less given up trying to make rational sense of it, suspecting his brain simply could not handle the reality of what was happening. And among all the surprising things about this other world, perhaps the most unexpected was how his airgun behaved here. His thoughts were interrupted by sounds coming from somewhere nearby. He turned to look and was shocked to find a group of goblins rushing directly toward him. He stared at the creatures, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Goblins were creatures of low intelligence, but they moved in groups, and that made them dangerous. One of them swung a sword at him, and he managed to dodge it. Another grabbed hold of his bag and sank its teeth into it. While Daisuke was trying to deal with the chaos, a sword blade cut through the air and struck the goblin, biting his back. A young woman appeared, holding a sword, and positioned herself between Daisuke and the creatures. She told him to get behind her, and he immediately did as she said, pressing himself behind her back and only then noticing that she was actually holding a real sword. The girl declared herself the goblin's opponent and told them to leave Daisuke alone. The goblin snarled in fury and charged at her. She called upon the strength of her sword and met them head-on. She moved quickly and with skill, swinging her blade in rapid and fluid motions, bringing the goblins down one after another. They crashed into the trees nearby and fell to the ground. While she was engaged with several of them, one goblin managed to circle behind her and swung a club at her back. She read the movement in time, dodged the blow, and immediately countered by driving her foot into the creature's stomach before finishing it with her sword. The remaining goblins, seeing how badly things were going, turned and fled. Daisuke watched the whole thing with open admiration, genuinely impressed by what he had just seen. The girl turned to check on him and asked whether he was all right. Daisuke said he was and thanked her with real relief, telling her she had genuinely saved him. She introduced herself as Rena, a traveling knight. He gave his own name and told her she could call him Daisuke. Rena smiled and remarked that it was an unusual name. She expressed relief that he had not been hurt and offered a traditional blessing upon him. They settled down together and made a small bonfire, placing potatoes on sticks and holding them near the flames to cook. Rena explained that when goblins gathered in packs, they became aggressive and violent, attacking both people and nearby settlements without hesitation. Daisuke took this in with understanding. Rena mentioned that she was currently assigned to a nearby village where her task was to exterminate the goblins that had been causing trouble in the surrounding area. Daisuke appreciated the directness and practicality of how she had explained her role, and remarked to himself that the ability to communicate clearly and efficiently was something he valued greatly in a professional context. He found himself thinking that he would want someone like her working at his company, if such a thing were possible. Rena seemed slightly surprised by the comment, and said he was young, but seemed to have a good head on his shoulders, though she brushed it off as nothing significant. She then shifted her attention to something that had caught her curiosity. She noted that she had never seen clothing like his before, as nothing of that style existed in the country. She also noticed his airsoft gun and asked whether it was some kind of unusually shaped protective talisman. Daisuke explained that it was actually a personal self-defense weapon. Rena was intrigued, but skeptical, wondering if it worked by being swung at someone, though she thought it probably would not do much damage either way. Rena stood up and pointed out that continuing to talk in the middle of a forest alone was not particularly safe. She said they should head to the village and that she would escort him there. Daisuke told her there was no need and insisted he was perfectly fine on his own. Rena reached out and took his hand and told him he did not have to pretend to be unafraid and that there was nothing at all embarrassing about not being a fighter. She explained that protecting those who could not protect themselves was the responsibility that came with being a knight, and said they should set off before the light faded. Daisuke accepted her offer and told her he would be in her care. They began walking through the forest together. After a while, Rena pointed ahead and told him the village was visible from there. As they moved through the trees, both of them noticed that the animals around them were behaving strangely. Every creature they could see seemed to be actively moving away from the area, as though avoiding something. Daisuke noticed it too. Rena's hand moved to the hilt of her sword as her expression became alert and watchful. She said quietly that there might be goblins somewhere nearby. Without warning, a tremendous crash shook the ground directly in front of them, and an enormous creature landed in their path. Both Rena and Daisuke were struck with shock at the sight of it. Daisuke noted immediately that whatever this thing was, it was massive and clearly not a goblin. The creature's growl rolled through the forest like thunder. It was a gargoyle, a magical beast created by casting sorcery on stone statues and setting them loose to attack people. The creature immediately reached out to grab Rena, but she moved quickly enough to avoid it. She identified the creature and expressed alarm at finding something so powerful in this particular location. She prepared herself for battle, reasoning that she could not allow it to go on a rampage so close to the village. Daisuke called out in a panic, asking whether she was going to be all right and suggesting strongly that they both simply run. Rena told him the village was too close to risk that. She instructed him to head to the village while she held the gargoyle off, and before he could respond, she had already charged toward the creature. She attempted a spinning slash, a technique involving a wide, circular motion with her sword, but the gargoyle blocked it with its arm. She immediately realized with alarm that her blade could not pierce its body at all. The gargoyle spread its arm and tried to bring it down on her like a stomp, and she barely managed to throw herself out of the way. She swung her sword again, but the attack had no noticeable effect. She understood the danger clearly. A gargoyle existed for one purpose, and that was to attack humans. And if this one reached the village, the consequences would be devastating. Before she could finish the thought, the creature struck her hard with its elbow, and she was thrown crashing to the ground. Daisuke watched from nearby and could see that Rena was in serious trouble and would not be able to hold out much longer. Then Rena forced herself back on her feet. Daisuke watched in astonishment. She told herself she could not possibly allow herself to be defeated there, but her body was already taking a toll from the fight. The gargoyle turned and rushed toward her to deliver a finishing blow. Rena closed her eyes and braced herself for the impact that was coming. Then a loud bang rang out through the forest air. The gargoyle was struck by something with considerable force. Rena looked toward the source of the sound and was stunned to see Daisuke standing with his weapon raised and pointed at the creature. Daisuke reflected briefly on everything that had brought him to this moment. Traveling to another world, encountering creatures beyond anything he had ever imagined, one surprise after another. But the thing that had surprised him most of all, more than any of it, was the power he had discovered within himself. He raised his weapon and fired at the gargoyle again. He had discovered that he possessed the ability to transform his airsoft gun into a fully functioning real firearm. Rena called out his name as the gargoyle steadied itself and roared at them both. She asked what the weapon was. Daisuke explained that what he held was a Glock 17, a semi-automatic pistol manufactured by the Glock company in Austria, chambered for 9mm parabellum rounds. He described one of its most notable characteristics as its body, which was constructed largely from polymer plastics to keep the overall weight low, and noted that compared to other handguns, it was exceptionally easy to handle and use. With a swift and practiced movement, Daisuke stepped out of the gargoyle's path as it attacked, and continued his explanation that the weapon allowed its user to respond to an enemy's movement almost instantly. He kept firing, shot after shot, the sound of each discharge echoing through the trees as he continued to engage the creature. He could see the gargoyle beginning to falter under the sustained fire. Rena stood watching with wide eyes, unable to fully comprehend what she was seeing. The idea that a gargoyle, a creature that might require multiple experienced veteran knights working together to bring down, was being defeated by a single person and without even using a sword, was beyond anything she had encountered before. It struck her as something close to divine power. The gargoyle crashed to the ground and did not get up. Daisuke ran immediately to Rena and asked whether she was all right. Rena addressed him using a formal and deeply respectful honorific that she had not used before. Daisuke was startled by the sudden change in how she was speaking to him. Rena bowed her head and apologized for having been disrespectful toward him earlier. She said that with power of that magnitude, he could only be the god of war himself. Daisuke immediately told her she had it completely wrong and asked her to lift her head. He reached into his things and handed her his business card. Rena examined it and noted that it was covered in writing she had never seen and could not read. Daisuke glanced at his watch and said it was probably time for him to head back. Rena said there was something she wanted to ask him. Daisuke said he understood and told her he would return as soon as his work obligations at his company were finished. Rena stared at him in complete confusion, unable to make sense of what he was saying. He simply told her to hold onto the name card and left it at that. Then he stepped through a glowing door that had appeared before him and vanished from sight entirely. Rena stood alone, looking at the space where he had been, and found herself wondering who on earth he truly was. Back in his own world, at his workplace, Koga Daisuke was 40 years old. When everything was laid out plainly, aside from the fact that he spent roughly half of his income on airsoft and survival game equipment, and that he stepped into another world through a glowing door directly after finishing work each day, he was really just a completely ordinary salaryman. 2 days earlier, Daisuke had been in the middle of an intense survival game match with only 30 seconds remaining. Through his headphones, he caught fragments of a conversation between his teammates and gathered that one of them was getting married. He remembered a recent dinner with the same group, where the man had reflected on how marriage would change his relationship with money and how he would no longer be able to spend freely, but it also said that living for the sake of someone else was not such a bad thing. He had cheerfully told Daisuke that he would find someone too. Back in the present moment of the game, Daisuke reminded himself that he was turning 40 years old that day. By most conventional measures, he had long since passed the point where settling down was expected of him. He had gotten so absorbed in survival games over the years without even noticing time passing. But inside, his heart still felt like it was in his 20s. The match continued, and his opponents acknowledged with some exasperation that he was as overwhelmingly skilled as always. As he moved through the game, the thought of living for the sake of another drifted through his mind. He reflected that he had always done everything on his own. Then a smoke screen appeared during the match, confusing him in the confined space. When the smoke cleared, he found that his surroundings had completely changed. He was no longer in the survival game arena. Before he could process what had happened, a thunderous roar reached his ears. He turned toward the sound and came face to face with an enormous griffin poised to seize him. He threw himself out of the way just in time to avoid being crushed. Then a voice reached him through his headphones, telling him to fight with everything he had. He could not understand who was speaking to him. The voice explained that it had given him the power to fight and urged him to use it well. In his panic, he raised his rifle and fired at the monster and was immediately stunned by the sound. It did not sound like an airsoft gun at all. It sounded like the real thing. He removed the magazine and stared at it. The rounds inside were real bullets. His airsoft gun had transformed into a functioning real firearm. He recognized the weapon. It was an M4 carbine, one of the most widely used assault rifles in the world, chambered for 5.56mm NATO rounds and capable of firing in 3-round burst mode, releasing 3 shots with a single pull of the trigger. He had trained in firearms handling during simulation sessions and understood the mechanics well, but he was still not certain whether this level of firepower would be enough against a creature of that scale. He pushed the doubt aside and told himself to trust in it. He steadied himself and fired at the griffin, but the creature spread its enormous wings and launched itself into the sky. It flew upward and then slowly dissolved and vanished from sight. A voice called out in approval. A girl appeared. She smiled at him and introduced herself as Krim, describing herself as an observer of this world. She explained to him that this place was what people from his world would call another world. Daisuke was stunned. Krim said she had used the griffin to confirm his capabilities. He was confused. She explained that she had been traveling through the world searching for strong individuals with battle experience, people like him. Daisuke tried to explain that his fighting experience came from survival games, that it was essentially just a hobby and not real combat. Krim told him he was mistaken. His abilities were genuine. It was not only his fighting skill she had been looking for, but also the quality of his character and his fundamental goodness as a person, and above all the fact that he never turned away from someone who needed help. Daisuke was surprised by how specifically she had described him. Krim then explained the situation. The world was on the verge of being consumed by a spreading malevolence, and if nothing was done, it would eventually collapse into chaos. She said her role was that of a pure observer, and she could not interfere directly with the world's events. And so, she wanted to ask Daisuke to help anyone he encountered who was in need, trusting that through those acts the world would gradually be brought back from the edge. She said she was completely confident he would succeed. Daisuke acknowledged that helping people in trouble was something he had no objection to, but he pointed out that he had a job and could not simply disappear without consequence. Krim told him not to worry about that. She waved her hand casually and a door appeared in the air. She explained that she had connected an entrance to this world directly to his closet. Daisuke stared at it and confirmed with shock that it really did open to his own room. Krim told him it was perfectly fine for him to come and go whenever he had the time. He could take it at his own pace and save the world when it suited him. Daisuke asked whether she meant he could do it whenever he had a free moment, and noted that these were rather relaxed working conditions. He said he understood what was being asked and had no objections and would do what he could. Krim then said that in exchange for his agreement, she would grant him special abilities to assist him. She explained that every tool or piece of equipment he carried would have the power to transform into its real-world counterpart when he was in this world. Daisuke immediately connected this to what had happened with the gun and confirmed that this meant his airsoft gun had become a real firearm. Krim also gave him a name card and instructed him to give it to the person he cared most about. In the other world, Rena looked at the card she had been given and her face brightened as she recognized it as something from Daisuke, the man she had met. Krim had explained that even across any distance, she had cast a spell on the card so that it would lead its holder to wherever Daisuke was. Coming back to the present, Daisuke opened the door to the other world and stepped through. Rena was surprised to see him return and immediately addressed him with deep respect. Daisuke greeted her with a warm smile and told her she had done well. Rena expressed genuine relief that he had truly come back as he had promised. Daisuke reminded her that he had said he would return, so of course he had. He then asked what it was she had wanted to ask him before he had left. Rena asked him to come with her. They walked together to the village and found it strangely empty, with no one visible outside. Then the people who had been hiding recognized Rena and came rushing out. The whole village erupted in relieved celebration at seeing her return safely. A young boy ran up to her and expressed how worried everyone had been. Rena addressed the boy as Rocco and told him she was perfectly fine, as she was strong after all. Daisuke was confused by the scene and the obvious distress the villagers had been living under. Rena then explained the situation to him. The village had been living under the control of a person called a tamer, someone with the ability to command monsters to do their bidding. Half a year earlier, this man had set his eyes on the village's harvest and had attacked with a horde of powerful monsters under his control. The villagers had tried to fight back, but were completely overwhelmed. The women of the village had been taken captive, and their food stores and money were being continuously seized. Rena had happened to pass through the village during one of her journeys and had decided to try to save them. She had confronted the tamer, a man named Murdoch, and demanded that he release the village and its hostages. Murdoch had acknowledged her skill, but dismissed her as nowhere near strong enough to challenge him. He had summoned an enormous monster to make his point clear, and had declared that the women of the village and everything in it were his to do with as he pleased. He had spoken about the laws of this world as he understood them, saying that strength determined everything and that the strong were always the victors. He had set his lizard men soldiers against Rena and had made a deeply threatening declaration about what he intended to do with her. Facing an overwhelming number of enemies, Rena had been forced to retreat. She told Daisuke all of this, explaining that she had been unable to do anything meaningful against Murdoch's power. The best she had managed to do was to deal with his goblin underling from time to time. And then she had met Daisuke, and for the first time she had felt something that looked like genuine hope. She clenched her fist tightly. She acknowledged that what she was about to ask was deeply selfish, but she closed her eyes and let her tears fall freely as she asked him to please lend her his strength. Daisuke looked at her and smiled, and told her of course he would help to the best of his ability. Rena could barely believe it. Daisuke said it was obvious he could not stand by and forgive what Murdoch was doing, and told her that her desire to save the villagers had genuinely moved him. Rena wept, and said she was truly grateful that someone like him existed in the world. The young boy Rocco came forward and asked Rena whether she was really going to deal with the bad people who had taken his mother. Rena promised him that she would bring his mother home without fail, and gently told him to be patient and wait. Murdoch's mansion had been built deep within the forest. Rena, now filled with a hope she had not felt before, resolved that this time things would be different. Beside her, Daisuke readied his weapon with quiet calm, prepared for whatever was ahead. At Murdoch's mansion, the man himself was in high spirits, laughing loudly and reveling in the life he had built for himself. He was of the firm belief that power was the key to everything: money, luxury, and whatever else a person could want. His mood turned sharply when he noticed one of the women serving wine was not doing it to his satisfaction, and he struck her. He reminded her, with chilling casualness, that he had the ability to control monsters, and that it would be very much in her interest to keep him happy. His celebration was interrupted when Daisuke and Rena came bursting in. Murdoch looked them over. He recognized Rena immediately as the knight who had fled after being defeated by him previously, and he found it amusing that she had returned. He assumed she had not yet learned from that experience. Rena told him plainly that she had come to make him release all the women he was holding. Murdoch noticed the sword she carried, and then shifted his gaze to Daisuke, taking in the sight of a lean and seemingly unremarkable young man standing beside her. He laughed at what he saw and remarked that Rena appeared to be seriously lacking in capable allies. With that, he announced that he intended to give everyone present an entertaining show, stretched out his hand, and summoned his monsters. What appeared were lizard men, reptilian warriors covered in thick, tough scales and armed with weapons. Daisuke was visibly startled at the sight of a lizard-like creature bearing a weapon and charging directly at him at full speed. Murdoch commanded his lizard men to tear both intruders apart. Rena was immediately surrounded and pressed into a corner. In that moment of danger, her thoughts went to Rocco and his promise to save his mother. She called upon the strength within her sword and unleashed her turning/slash technique, bringing down one of the lizard men. But the second one launched itself at her before she could recover. She managed to block its attack, but was driven hard into the ground by the force of it. The lizard man loomed over her and prepared to finish her off. Then a loud bang rang out through the room. It was Daisuke, opening fire. He shot the lizard man repeatedly until it went down. Murdoch was visibly startled. He could not understand what he was seeing. Daisuke was releasing some kind of powerful projectile without any chanting, without any visible spell work, firing what appeared to be invisible arrows at tremendous speed. Rena got back to her feet, genuinely impressed by what Daisuke had just done. Murdoch, on the other hand, was struggling to accept it. His lizard men were creatures whose bites could crush bone and whose scales functioned like armor, and yet this thin, strange-looking young man had taken one down with apparent ease. The hostages murmured among themselves. Murdoch demanded to know who Daisuke was, asking whether he was some kind of sorcerer or spirit user. Daisuke introduced himself. His name was Koga Daisuke, section chief of the Tsukeda Training Design Planning Division. A salaryman. Murdoch had absolutely no idea what that meant, and had never heard of such a classification. While Murdoch tried to make sense of it, Daisuke was quietly assessing the situation himself. The level of opposition he was facing was within what he could handle, he decided, and he turned his attention to the remaining lizard men and continued firing. Murdoch watched his monsters being dismantled and declared them useless. He turned and ran from the room, announcing that he had no choice but to reach into his private collection for something else. He produced another creature and released it, commanding it to devour his enemies as it pleased. Outside the main room, one of the lizard men had cornered Daisuke and charged at him. He fired, but this one used a shield to deflect the shot. It leaped toward him. Before it could reach him, an enormous plant creature suddenly appeared and wrapped itself around the lizard men, pulling them in and beginning to consume them. It was a large carnivorous plant of the man-eater variety, a creature capable of moving on its own, possessing enough intelligence to actively hunt and trap living beings. Both Rena and Daisuke were taken aback by its sudden appearance. Murdoch laughed with obvious pride, telling them to enjoy a taste of his prize collection. Lena charged at the plant monster and sliced through its tentacles, but to her shock the wounds closed almost immediately. The plant was regenerating. Murdoch shouted that her efforts were pointless. Conventional bladed weapons would do nothing to it, as any damage would heal in an instant. Daisuke fired into the creature and watched the same thing happen. Every wound closed as quickly as it had opened. Lena told him it was useless, that the regenerative ability was far too powerful, and that only an attack of overwhelming force would have any real effect. A tentacle came sweeping toward Lena, but she threw herself out of the way just in time. Daisuke turned something over in his mind. If the creature could regenerate normally inflicted damage, there had to be a threshold, an attack powerful enough that it simply could not keep up with. He reached back into his memory and thought of Krim, who had told him that his closet back home in this world would remain connected, and that he could access it at any time. That connection was the key to what he needed to do next. Daisuke reached through the portal connected to his closet and pulled out a weapon, a shotgun. Murdoch continued to shout from across the room, declaring that nothing could stop his creature until it had consumed every living thing in the vicinity and that they were all finished. At that moment, one of the plant monster's tentacles struck Lena with full force. She was barely conscious, and in her dazed state, she thought she saw Oliver standing over her, asking if she was all right. But it was only her mind playing tricks on her. It was Daisuke calling her name, warning her to stay alert. She looked up and found him standing there. Daisuke turned the shotgun on the man-eater plant and fired. The explosion was tremendous, and the creature's body was blown apart. Murdoch could not believe what he was seeing. The plant's regenerative ability had seemed absolute, and yet this weapon had overwhelmed it entirely. He stared at the gun in Daisuke's hands and demanded to know what it was. Daisuke explained it with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what he was working with. The weapon was a Franchi Spaz 12, a shotgun produced by the Luigi Franchi Company in Italy. The name stood for Special Purpose Automatic Shotgun. It was a weapon used by both military and police forces, capable of firing an unending supply of 12-gauge shells. While it lacked penetration power at longer distances, at close range, it could completely obliterate most targets. He cocked the weapon again and looked at the plant creature, noting that some nations refer to weapons like this as miniature cannons, tools built specifically for close-quarters combat. He fired again into the man-eater plant, stating that with this level of force, the creature would not be able to regenerate its wounds fast enough to keep up. He asked Lena whether the monster had any specific weak point. She told him it did. Plant monsters of this kind always carried a core organ deep within their bodies, sometimes called a stem cell or regeneration point, and destroying it completely was the only way to truly defeat one. Daisuke fired again. The impact forced the creature's body open. Lena immediately called out that the core was visible. Daisuke did not hesitate. He leaped directly into the opening while the plant was still recovering from the blast, pressed the barrel of the shotgun against the core, and fired. The sound of the shot rang out through the room. The man-eater plant shuddered, collapsed, and burned away into the ground. Murdoch stood in stunned disbelief. His prized creature, something he had considered beyond defeat, was gone. Lena moved in front of him before he could do anything. He recoiled in surprise and immediately tried to negotiate his way out, offering her money, then a portion of everything he had taken from the village, 30%, then half. Lena's response was a single clean strike to his chin. Murdoch hit the ground hard. Later, everyone returned to the village. The villagers celebrated openly, overjoyed to have their women home at last. Rocco found his mother again in the crowd. One of the villagers bound Murdoch with rope and announced that he would be handed over to the proper authorities. Rocco ran to Lena and expressed his gratitude with everything he had. She smiled back at him. The boy asked her whether she was leaving now, and told her he wished she would stay in the village instead. Lena looked at him gently and explained that she was traveling in search of someone, which meant she could not remain for long. Later, as Lena and Daisuke walked together into the forest, he asked her about the person she was looking for. She told him the story. The person she sought was the one who had raised her and trained her in swordsmanship, a white knight named Oliver. One day, without warning, he had left behind only his sword and vanished. He had once promised her that he would always be there to watch her grow into a proper knight, but she had still not become one, and he was gone. Daisuke listened to her, and then told her he would help her search for him. Lena was surprised by the offer. He explained that he had always had a certain habit. He found it impossible to simply walk away from someone who needed help. He asked her again whether she would accept. Lena smiled and told him she would not refuse, and that in fact she was grateful for it. Daisuke then told her he would return once he had finished attending to his work on the other side. He stepped into the portal and disappeared back into his closet. Lena stood watching the place where he had been, smiling quietly to herself and thanking him in her heart. From somewhere nearby, Krim had been watching everything unfold. She smiled to herself as well, satisfied and certain that choosing Daisuke had been exactly the right decision. The scene shifted back to the world on the other side, a world of buildings and busy streets, filled with people rushing through their working days. Inside an office, some of Daisuke's colleagues had been noticing a change in him recently. They remarked among themselves that he had been in noticeably good spirits, and one of them suggested with a knowing smile that he had probably finally met someone. They had no idea what was actually happening. The man they worked alongside every day had been crossing into another world, and the bond forming between him and a traveling female knight was only just beginning. What neither of them could know yet was that this encounter between the two of them, an ordinary salaryman and a knight searching for the person who had raised her, would eventually set into motion events that would change the fate of her entire world. The port was alive with the sounds and movement of workers going about their busy day when a door portal suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The workers nearby stopped and stared at it, unable to make sense of what they were seeing. Then Daisuke stepped out of it and found himself looking at the sea stretching out before him, which caught him completely off guard. Lena spotted him immediately and called out to him. The two greeted each other, and Lena told him where they were, the port city of Sessin Norma. Daisuke took in the energy of the place and remarked on how lively it was. Lena explained that the constant flow of goods through the port naturally drew a crowd, and that people waiting for their ships to depart often stayed in the city overnight, filling it with activity. She also mentioned that she believed there might be a clue about Oliver somewhere in a place this busy. Daisuke agreed that with so many people passing through, the chances of finding someone who knew something about Oliver were reasonably good. As they walked together through the city, they came across a man calling out loudly to gather a crowd. He was recruiting participants for challenge matches at the coliseum, promising a reward of 100 gold pieces to whoever came out as champion. Daisuke asked Lena what was going on. She explained that it was a recruitment announcement for coliseum bouts. Daisuke was genuinely amazed, not just to hear about a coliseum, but to learn that one was actually in operation rather than merely a ruin. He reflected that the structure had originally been built to host performances and competitions, but since the current lord had taken control of it, it had been converted into a venue for fights and had gradually become a place for gambling, drawing in a rougher crowd over time. Lena said she had never heard anything good about the place and suggested they both keep their distance from it. At that moment, someone came rushing past them from behind and collided with Lena. The force of it sent her stumbling, and Daisuke instinctively reached out and caught her so she would not fall. The person who had run into her was a young woman wearing a hood, and for a brief moment she and Daisuke made eye contact as she kept moving without stopping. Lena, once she had steadied herself, became suddenly aware that she was holding on to Daisuke and immediately stepped back, bowing and apologizing. She insisted it was her own fault for being caught off balance by the collision, and said she had not intended to grab him like that. Daisuke told her it was perfectly fine and thought nothing of it. He looked in the direction the hooded young woman had gone and noticed her pushing past other people as she ran, clearing a path through the crowd. Later, the two of them sat down at a place called Sango's Eatery. A serving of wood-grilled and nut steak was placed on the table before them. Daisuke remarked at once on how good it looked. Lena told him she was glad and explained that she wanted him to consider this her way of thanking him for earlier. She described the nut as a common large fish found near the water surface, and the wood-grilled steak as a local specialty of the area. Before eating, Lena gave a quiet word of thanks for the food and for the bounty of the ocean and the land. Daisuke joined in with his own enthusiastic expression of gratitude before digging in. As they ate, Daisuke declared it delicious. Lena mentioned that the nut reminded her a great deal of mackerel. Daisuke agreed and found himself thinking about how well the fish would pair with ginger soy sauce or ponzu, and how much he would have loved to have it alongside Japanese sake. Lena, for her part, was visibly happy. Her expression while eating gave it away completely. When she noticed Daisuke watching her, she asked if something was the matter. He told her that her face had taken on a certain look when she smiled. She went slightly red and asked whether he found it strange. He told her quite the opposite. She brightened and told him that since it was her treat today, he should feel free to order as much as he liked. She reached into her pocket for her wallet, and her expression shifted immediately. She looked worried. Daisuke noticed the change and looked at her in confusion. Lena told him her wallet was gone. Daisuke was taken aback. Lena put it together quickly. It had to have happened when the hooded young woman ran into her. At that same moment, in her room elsewhere in the city, the hooded woman was going through the pouch she had lifted from Lena. She noted with satisfaction that the knight had been carrying quite a bit. She also noticed the man who had been with her, remarking to herself that his clothing had been very unusual. When she went through the pouch more carefully, she found a small card, Daisuke's business card. She held it up and studied it, unable to read the letters on it and finding it entirely unfamiliar. She wondered to herself who this person could possibly be. Back at the eatery, Lena apologized to Daisuke with genuine distress, worried most of all about the card she had been carrying, the one he had given her, which she had valued and now lost along with everything else. Daisuke told her that if she was talking about his business cards, he had plenty more of them and not to worry about it at all. He waved off her concern and told her he would take care of the meal himself, then handed a bill over to the person at the counter. The cashier looked at what he had given her with visible confusion and disbelief, then flicked the paper bill away, clearly having no idea what it was or what it was supposed to be worth. Daisuke watched in disbelief as his 10,000 bill floated through the air after being flicked away. The cashier raised her voice and made it clear that they only accepted copper and silver coins as payment. Daisuke acknowledged the blunder and then asked, in what turned out to be another failed attempt, whether some kind of wireless transaction might work instead. A short while later, Lena had changed into a waitress uniform and was moving through the eatery, carrying food to the customers, apologizing to each table for the wait. The patrons were visibly taken with her appearance, murmuring among themselves about how charming she was and wondering whether she was aware of the effect she was having. One customer immediately called out to her, eager to place his order. Outside the eatery, word had already begun to spread among passers-by that a remarkably attractive new waitress had been hired, and people were making their way over to see for themselves. The owner of the eatery had made it plain to Lena that she intended to work her hard to cover the cost of what they owed, and Lena accepted this without complaint, telling her she would give it her full effort. Meanwhile, the steady sound of wood being split filled the air out back. An elderly man watching Daisuke work remarked that he had impressive strength. Daisuke thanked him for saying so. The old man admitted quite sincerely that Daisuke had saved him from having to do the work himself, noting with a laugh that he was getting on in years. Lena came by briefly to apologize to Daisuke again for the situation they had ended up in because of her stolen wallet, feeling responsible for the fact that they were both now working off a meal debt. Daisuke told her it was perfectly fine and that he was genuinely enjoying the work. He was also turning a practical problem over in his mind. He needed to find a reliable way to obtain money in this world, or things were going to become increasingly difficult for both of them. He amused himself that in games, money came from defeating enemies, though he acknowledged that was a strange system when you actually thought about it. Inside the eatery, a commotion was starting. A man was causing trouble. Angry at being charged for a drink he claimed he had not even touched. The hooded young woman from earlier heard the noise and looked in through the window from outside. The elderly owner stood her ground, pointing out that he had spilled the drink himself and that it was entirely his own fault. The man pushed further, saying he expected the food to be written off as well. The owner refused outright, recognizing immediately that he was attempting to eat and leave without paying. The man lost his temper and drew his sword, furious at what he called being made a fool of. Lena saw what was happening and immediately stepped in, planting herself between the man and the elderly owner and telling the man that if he wanted to fight, she would be his opponent. At the same time, Daisuke moved to stand in front of the old woman, putting himself between her and the threat. Both the owner and the hooded girl watching from outside reacted with surprise. The man turned his fury on Daisuke, shouting at him to get out of the way. The other patrons in the eatery fell into a tense silence, watching. Daisuke told the man calmly that he was disturbing everyone around him and asked him to stop. This only made the man angrier. He raised his sword and charged at Daisuke, screaming at him. The elderly owner cried out for Daisuke to run, certain he was about to be seriously hurt. Before the man could follow through, Daisuke fired. The shot struck the sword and it flew from the man's grip. The man cried out in pain. The hooded girl watching from outside was visibly startled. Lena moved toward Daisuke in alarm, but he reassured her that he had used a rubber bullet. The scene briefly shifted to a memory. Krim had once told Daisuke that in addition to being able to convert his airsoft guns into functional firearms, he also had the ability to choose any type of ammunition he wanted at will. Daisuke had found this remarkably useful, and Krim had told him to use the ability however he saw fit. Back in the eatery, the man's companions were not ready to back down and threatened to make Daisuke pay for what he had done. Before they could act, Daisuke fired again, striking the hand of the one carrying an axe. The weapon dropped. The rubber ammunition Daisuke was using had been developed in the real world as a means of suppressing riders. It had a shorter range than metal projectiles, but delivered an impact comparable to a punch from a professional heavyweight boxer. Daisuke explained to them plainly that the pain would be enough to render them unconscious, but would not kill them. The effect was immediate. The man who had started the whole incident abandoned all pretense of aggression and apologized on the spot, promising to pay. The hooded girl outside was impressed, watching everything with open admiration. Daisuke then turned back to the elderly owner and apologized for stepping away from his work in the yard. The old woman would hear none of it, patting him on the back and telling him that thanks to him, she was still alive and in one piece. She said he had done very well for himself. She then looked at both Daisuke and Lena and, with a knowing expression, pointed out that they probably had nothing left to cover a place to sleep either. She told them they could use the room on the second floor. Lena was overwhelmed with gratitude and thanked her warmly. Daisuke expressed that it was a relief, especially for Lena. The owner added that the eatery happened to be short on help anyway, so Lena was welcome to stay as long as she needed to, until she had saved up enough to move on. Later, Lena was taking a bath, quietly reflecting on how close things had come to going very wrong and how fortunate it was that they had ended up being taken care of after all. Outside, Daisuke finished the last of the chopping and noted to himself that it was getting late and he needed to head back. Before he could move, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and found the hooded young woman from earlier standing there. She asked him whether he was some kind of magic user. Daisuke recognized her immediately. She held up Lena's stolen purse and asked whether he was perhaps looking for it. Daisuke told her it belonged to Lena and demanded she return it. The young woman asked why he did not simply come at her the way he had handled the troublemaker inside. Daisuke looked at her for a moment and then turned away, telling her plainly that he would not attack someone who was unarmed. She was visibly surprised by this. She told him he was quite naive, but that she did not dislike it. Then in a single swift movement, she was standing directly in front of him. She told him she had a proposal, She wanted him to come with her to the Coliseum. She laid out what she had in mind. He would fight against all the warriors there together with her, and they would win, with the goal of claiming the prize. Chapter 5 opened with the young woman addressing Daisuke by name, confirming she had remembered it correctly. She then stepped forward and hugged him, introducing herself as Ashley. She looked directly into his eyes and put her proposal to him again, telling him she thought the arrangement she was offering was genuinely worthwhile for both of them. Daisuke stood there caught off guard, and at that moment the door opened. Rena appeared and took in the scene in front of her. Daisuke standing there with Ashley's arms around him. She was visibly startled and asked who this person was. Daisuke explained that this was the one who had stolen her purse. Ashley introduced herself to Rena with an easy confidence. Rena's surprise shifted immediately into anger, and she demanded that Ashley return what she had taken. Ashley told her to settle down, brushing off the significance of the stolen money entirely, pointing out that the amount in the purse was trivial to her now, that she had a way to get far more than that. Rena did not understand what she meant. When Ashley laid out the full plan, Rena was taken aback to hear that she wanted to enter the Coliseum with Daisuke. Ashley was confident that as long as Daisuke could use whatever technique he had used on the troublemaker earlier, they would be fine. She described the Coliseum's format. It was a free-for-all battle where dozens of skilled fighters competed against one another, with the last person standing claiming the grand prize of 100 gold coins. However, Ashley acknowledged that there was a complication. The winner of the battle royale did not simply walk away with the prize. They were then required to face the Coliseum's boss, a man called Dorgan. Dorgan possessed overwhelming strength and had never once been defeated since the very first challenge battle was held. But if someone could get past him, the 100 gold coins were theirs to take. Rena stepped in firmly and urged Daisuke not to be persuaded by Ashley's pitch. She warned him that the Coliseum was genuinely dangerous and explained something important that Ashley had glossed over. Some of the participants were not there by choice. The town's lord, Hilbert, was forcing local residents into the fights to fill the numbers. Anyone who wanted out had to pay 50 gold coins to be released, and that was not a sum that was easy to come by for most people. Ashley cut back in, dismissing the concern by pointing out that since both she and Daisuke were outsiders, that rule would not apply to them. As far as she was concerned, they would simply walk in, win, and leave. Rena said that was not the point she was trying to make. Ashley turned back to Daisuke and pressed him for an answer. Daisuke told her plainly that he could not bring himself to trust her. It was clear to him that she was holding something back, something significant that she had chosen not to share. He explained that through his many years working as a salaryman, he had dealt with enough people who withheld the truth that he had developed an ability to sense it simply by looking into someone's eyes. Working in that environment for so long had sharpened that instinct in him. Ashley absorbed this and asked whether that meant his answer was no, regardless of anything she might say. She remarked that it was a shame. She had sensed something unusual about him and had thought she was on to something meaningful. Then she bolted, leaping away through the trees before Rena could stop her. Rena called after her to return the purse, but Ashley was already gone. As she ran, she was quietly calculating to herself. She had spent 50 gold coins somewhere and had 45 remaining. Back where Daisuke and Rena stood, Daisuke glanced at his watch and was jolted by what he saw. It was already time for work. He told Rena he had to go back immediately and ran for the portal door leading to his closet. Once through it and back in his own world, he moved quickly. It was already 7:30 in the morning, and he had no time to waste. Back at the eatery, the elderly owner listened as Rena told her about the Coliseum encounter, and her expression grew heavy. She explained that after the fall of the Ferdia Kingdom, everything had changed when the governing lord was replaced, and what had once been a relatively straightforward institution had become something ugly and corrupt. She recalled that when the challenge battles had first been introduced, the kind of unsavory elements seen there now had not been part of it. She then said something that surprised Rena. She wondered aloud who would ever be capable of defeating Dorgan and rendering Hilbert speechless again, the way someone apparently once had. Rena was caught off guard by the implication that it had happened before. At Hilbert's castle, the atmosphere was one of barely contained violence. A figure wearing an iron mask and bound with heavy chains was destroying everything within reach around him. Lord Hilbert arrived to check on the situation. His servants reported on the condition of the chained figure, a man called Dorgan. They told Hilbert that Dorgan was in peak physical condition and that there were no signs of the body rejecting the regeneration magic that had been applied to him. Lord Hilbert looked over the scene with a satisfied smile, pleased with what he had in Dorgan. He reflected that as long as his spells held, he could bend a warrior of that caliber entirely to his will. He mused on what he saw as a timeless truth, that people had always been drawn to the spectacle of brutal combat, and that this was the very reason they flocked to the Coliseum. In his view, there was no greater pleasure available to human beings than the thrill of watching others fight, which made the Coliseum the most profitable venture imaginable. He ordered his subordinates to gather the people for the next match. Back inside the eatery, the portal door opened and Daisuke stepped through. He immediately heard a familiar voice raised in distress. The elderly woman who ran the eatery was confronting a group of guards, demanding to know why they were dragging her husband away. She was furious, pointing out that her husband was 70 years old. Daisuke made his way to Rena, who was already there, and explained the situation to him. The owner of the restaurant had apparently been selected to participate in the coliseum. Daisuke tried to appeal to the guard's reason, suggesting that forcing a man of that age into a fight was clearly going too far. The guards were not interested in his opinion and demanded to know who he was, informing him that this was a random selection process officially mandated by Lord Hilbert and made public knowledge. They told the elderly woman that if she wished to refuse, she could produce 50 gold coins. Alternatively, she could sell the restaurant. The woman was struck speechless by the audacity of it, and the guards gave her no time to gather herself, demanding an immediate decision. She acknowledged the impossible math. The restaurant brought in no more than a single gold coin each month, which meant 50 gold coins was entirely out of reach. The guards grabbed her husband and moved to take him. Faced with no other option, the woman agreed to sell the restaurant. Then a clear voice cut through the moment. Rena stepped forward, holding her sword, and told the guards she would go to the coliseum in the old man's place. The guard were surprised and exchanged looks. The elderly woman spun to Rena in alarm, unable to believe what she had just heard her say. Rena responded by drawing her sword in a swift, controlled motion that made the nearest guard flinch back. She leveled the blade at his face and stated plainly that even in her current circumstances, she was still a knight and had full confidence in her abilities. The guard collected himself and agreed. If she was willing to substitute for the old man, there was no issue with that from their end. The elderly woman begged Rena to reconsider, telling her she did not truly understand what she was getting herself into. Ashley appeared at that point and offered to join as well, though she made clear that if they won, she expected half of the prize money. Daisuke then said that if Rena was going, he would go too. Rena was startled by this. Daisuke told her simply that he was being true to who he was. He could not do otherwise. Rena turned to the elderly woman and apologized, telling her she would have to step away from her work at the eatery. The old woman stared at all of them in disbelief, struggling to accept that they were completely serious. Rena told her with quiet confidence that they were going to try to defeat Dorgan and leave Lord Hilbert without words. At the Coliseum, the announcement rang out that the battle challenge was about to begin, and anyone confident in their abilities was directed to enter through the participants' entrance. A steady stream of fighters and knights poured in. The announcer worked the crowd into a frenzy, declaring that the moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived, the entrance of the combatants. The crowd erupted. Rena and Daisuke took in the wall of noise with some surprise. Members of the audience shouted for blood, calling for the fighters to cut each other down. Among the combatants, there was already boasting and posturing, each one declaring they intended to be the last one standing. Ashley looked over the field of fighters with cool assessment. Compared to Daisuke, she thought none of them were anything worth worrying about. She reminded herself that she was still owed 50 gold coins out of the winnings and kept that figure firmly in mind. Lord Hilbert addressed the assembled crowd from his position of authority, praising the fighters for their courage in gathering there and announcing that the last warrior standing would be awarded 100 gold coins. He gave the signal, and the battle began. A horn sounded across the entire arena, loud enough to feel as well as hear. The combatants immediately fell upon one another. The clashing of swords and shields filled the air from every direction. Daisuke and Rena positioned themselves back to back in the middle of it all, covering each other's blind spots. Rena told Daisuke she was trusting him to guard what was behind her. Daisuke told her she could count on it. Rena and Daisuke stood their ground as the fighters inside the arena began closing in on them from multiple directions. One of the more prominent combatants was a heavily armored knight named Herobodius, who announced his intention to prove himself in the arena and swung his blade with confidence. Rena moved with speed and precision, deflecting his sword in a single fluid motion that sent him crashing into a cluster of other knights nearby. More warriors came without pause. One charged directly at Rena, announcing that he would be the last one standing and telling her she was finished. Another came from a different angle with the same intent. Rena called upon her strength through a practice technique and then launched into a relentless series of sword exchanges, meeting each attacker head-on before catching one of them off guard with a sharp strike from her knee that brought him down. Still more fighters turned their attention toward her, drawn by her performance and eager to be the one to take her down. Rena shifted her footing and released a powerful circular shockwave using a technique she called the sonic zapper, sending the warriors directly in front of her, stumbling and crashing to the ground. One of the fighters watching from the edges of the ongoing battle took stock of what he had just seen and reached a calculated conclusion. He recognized that Rena was no self-taught brawler. She was a trained swordswoman, and anyone without formal training had no chance against her in a direct confrontation. The only viable approach, he decided, was to come at her from the side. He broke into a run, angling toward her flank. But Daisuke was already watching. Without hesitation, he fired a single shot that struck the man squarely in the stomach, sending him rolling across the ground from the force of the impact. Another warrior nearby witnessed this and was completely baffled, unable to identify what had just happened or whether it was some form of magic. Daisuke assessed the weapon in his hands with quiet satisfaction. It was a Colt, government-issued model, chambered for 0.45 ACP rounds rather than the smaller 8mm Parabellum. The caliber was larger and made the gun easier to manage than some alternatives. The trade-off was range. but at close quarters the weight of the round delivered a shock on impact that was extremely difficult to shrug off. Another warrior attempted to rush him and was shot before he could close the distance, stopping completely in his tracks from the impact of a single round. Daisuke noted to himself that one shot was reliably enough to halt a person's movement, and reminded himself that all of it was rubber-tipped, non-lethal, but punishing. The crowd had become electric. People were on their feet, pointing and shouting, demanding to know who the man with the strange weapon was. Excitement rippled through the stands. Daisuke leveled the weapon at the remaining warriors nearby, and made clear that anyone who came at him would be shot. The fighters paused, sizing him up warily and holding their position. Across the arena, Herodias was slowly hauling himself back to his feet, grimacing from the pain of Lena's earlier deflection. He muttered to himself that she was genuinely formidable, and that he had perhaps underestimated her, but told himself that the next time would be different. Meanwhile, Lena continued moving through the arena, engaging fighter after fighter, while Daisuke covered their rear by picking off anyone who approached from behind. In another corner of the arena, a small group of people were clearly not fighters by any measure. They had been forced into the coliseum against their will and had no intention of actually fighting, with at least one of them admitting he had never held a sword before being dragged there. One of the nastier combatants in the arena spotted them and saw an opportunity, deciding they would be easy to deal with and moving toward them with contempt, intending to eliminate them and collect the prize without breaking a sweat. Before his sword could fall, a powerful slash came out of nowhere and caught his arm, knocking him to the ground. It was Ashley. She planted herself in front of the helpless group and warned the man that if he intended to touch any of them, he would be dealing with her instead. The man was caught off guard. Ashley looked at him more carefully and asked if his name was Ethan. The man was startled and demanded to know how she knew that. Ashley told him she had been searching for someone wearing a scarf exactly like the one around his neck. The noise of the crowd swelled and crashed around the arena like a wave. In the stands, the elderly woman from the eatery had made her way there, driven by worry for the young people she had come to care about. She took in the enormous crowd and the scale of everything unfolding before her, and found herself genuinely uncertain whether things were going to be all right. Nearby, a man was working the crowd hard, calling for anyone who had not yet placed a bet to do so immediately. He announced that the current highest odds were on the strangely dressed young man and the night girl fighting alongside him. Inside the arena, one of the remaining warriors was sharing the same assessment with the fighters near him. The girl was impressively skilled, but the oddly clothed man beside her was the one to be truly afraid of. One of the warriors warned the others that they would be taken down before they even got close to Daisuke. The remaining fighters studied him more carefully and noticed something that set him apart from Lena. While she had been moving through the arena, taking opponents out one after another, Daisuke had not yet put anyone down in a direct one-on-one exchange. The fighters put this together and concluded that the answer was to overwhelm him with numbers rather than face him individually. Daisuke noticed them drawing this conclusion and watched as they began coordinating their approach. They came at him together, and he moved quickly, evading their combined attacks. One of the knights laughed as they pressed him, pointing out that even if Daisuke managed to deal with one of them, the other would cut him down while he was occupied. Daisuke leaped back out of reach and acknowledged to himself that it was actually a sound strategy. In that situation, it was the right call. But as Lena watched from across the arena and called out in disgust at the ganging up, Daisuke was already moving. He pushed both arms into the portal connected to his closet and searched inside it while the warriors looked on in bewilderment, completely unable to understand what they were seeing. In another part of the arena, Ashley was dealing with a different problem. She had gathered the group of people who had been forced into the fight against their will and was telling them plainly to stop fighting and run. She explained that while the last person standing won the prize, losing did not mean death. A fighter could end their participation simply by yielding and lying down. The group broke into tearful despair, explaining that losing would only mean being sent back for another round of fights. There was no way out of the arrangement for them. Ashley shut her eyes and told them firmly to stop complaining. She said that if they made it out alive, they would find a way to deal with the rest, but for now the only priority was staying alive and getting clear. She was still mid-sentence when a thunderous sound erupted from somewhere in the arena and snapped everyone's attention toward it. What they saw was Daisuke firing repeatedly into an armored knight and driving him hard into the ground. Ashley stared at the weapon in his hand, something she had not seen him use before, wondering what the strange-looking device was. It was an Ingram M10, an American-made submachine gun. A submachine gun was a weapon capable of firing pistol-grade ammunition in rapid succession, shot after shot without pause. The M10 in particular was more maneuverable than an assault rifle, making it well-suited to the kind of close-quarter situation the arena presented. Daisuke used it to cut down anyone who rushed toward him. Its ability to engage multiple targets rapidly made it exceptionally effective. The crowd watching from the stands reacted with roaring excitement, thrilled by what they were witnessing. Ashley watched with open admiration, telling herself that this person was truly something extraordinary, and that if anyone in that arena had a real chance of winning, it was Daisuke. Up in his viewing position, Lord Hilbert watched the unfolding battle with a small, satisfied smile. He remarked that they appeared to have a genuinely strong contender this time around, and called one of his soldiers over. He gave the order to release Dorgan. The soldier hesitated, questioning whether it was wise to let Dorgan out this early in the fight. Hilbert dismissed the concern, explaining that having Dorgan enter when only 1 or 2 fighters were left standing would take all the excitement out of it. The soldier acknowledged the order and moved to begin preparations immediately. Inside the arena, the combatants suddenly became aware that something had changed. The massive gate swung open without warning. The chains binding Dorgan's arms released with a sharp sound, and he came charging into the arena at full speed. He entered swinging, and any warrior caught in his path was sent flying through the air from the sheer force of the impact. Those who were not hit immediately turned and ran, sheer terror overriding any fighting instinct they had. Dorgan came to a stop, and his gaze settled directly on Daisuke. Rena and Ashley went rigid. Daisuke's eyes went wide at the sight of the creature standing before him. The sheer size of it was beyond anything he had prepared himself for. The announcer's voice rang out over the roar of the crowd, declaring to everyone present that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the entrance of the arena's mightiest warrior. The crowd erupted into the loudest noise yet. Dorgan let out a roar that resonated through the entire space. He reached out and seized 2 of the warriors nearby, lifting them both off the ground at once. They could only cry out helplessly. Daisuke opened fire on Dorgan. It had no effect whatsoever. A massive fist came sweeping toward him, and he threw himself out of the way just in time to avoid it. Rena called to him, and he confirmed he was still in one piece, though he acknowledged that what they were facing was far more dangerous than anything he had anticipated. The remaining combatants were in full panic. Fighters were saying aloud that no one had warned them Dorgan would be this monstrous, and that the idea of defeating something like that was impossible. Lord Hilbert rose from his seat and addressed everyone still standing inside the arena. He told them that if any of them wanted their freedom, there was only one path to it. They had to fight. His words dropped over the arena like a weight, and everything inside went completely silent. He let the moment sit, and then posed the question directly, whether any of them were truly capable of defeating the strongest warrior who had ever stood in that arena. Dorgan stood over the arena like a wall of muscle and aggression, letting out a low growl that seemed to fill the entire space. Every fighter still standing was visibly frightened. Rena gripped her sword and steadied herself, preparing for what was coming. Some of the remaining warriors tried to convince themselves and each other that sheer numbers could overcome the size advantage, and a group of them rushed Dorgan together in a coordinated assault. It made no difference. Dorgan handled the group with ease, swatting them aside without appearing to strain himself in the slightest. The fighters who witnessed it fell into open panic, unable to comprehend what they were supposed to do against something like that. Ashley told the nearest terrified warrior to hold his position and wait, and then she dashed forward onto the battlefield herself. Rena noticed and was alarmed, wondering if Ashley intended to take Dorgan on alone. Ashley said that was not the plan at all, and that she simply expected someone would join her. Rena was confused by the logic, but moved in anyway. Dorgan swung his massive arm at both of them simultaneously, and the 2 women threw themselves out of the way. Rena slashed at his arm as she moved past, and immediately registered something wrong. Her blade had connected, but the result was not what she expected. She called to Ashley to get clear. Before Dorgan could close his hand around Ashley, Daisuke opened fire on his arm in rapid succession. The shots made Dorgan pause, and his attention shifted to Daisuke. Daisuke confirmed Ashley was unhurt, and Rena came to regroup with them. Daisuke told the others he had switched to live rounds, which should have been effective against a target of that size. One of the guards watching from the side was staring at Dorgan's wounds with something between alarm and fascination. The damaged tissue was visibly regenerating. He reported to Lord Hilbert that the regeneration magic appeared to be working exactly as intended. Hilbert acknowledged this with mild satisfaction before his attention drifted. The guard mentioned he would report the results back to their country immediately. Hilbert reflected aloud that while using the coliseum to extract money from the public was a useful arrangement, his true interest was far simpler. He wanted to watch Dorgan fight. He directed Dorgan to use his overwhelming strength to bring everyone in the arena to their knees. At that moment, a single knight came crashing dramatically down into the arena as though making a grand entrance, landing and announcing himself as Herodias III before issuing a formal challenge to Dorgan in the form of a duel. The difference in scale between the two was almost absurd. Herodias looked tiny beside Dorgan, and Dorgan made short work of him, kicking him aside without breaking his stride. The crowd was awed by the display of raw power and grew increasingly convinced that Dorgan was going to win this match as easily as everyone before it. Then the crowd noticed Daisuke. He was moving forward at a run toward Dorgan, the fighters around him pointing at the strangely dressed young man, charging ahead of everyone else. Daisuke closed the distance and opened fire directly at Dorgan, and Dorgan's pained grunt echoed through the arena. The warriors who had been struggling and failing earlier felt a wave of relief wash over them. They cheered Daisuke on, shouting for him to finish it. He fired into Dorgan's chest with a shotgun, and Dorgan stopped moving, but he did not fall. He stood in place, riddled with wounds, still upright. Daisuke stared at him in disbelief. Even after a direct hit from the shotgun at that range, Dorgan was still on his feet. The warriors watching were equally stunned, unable to understand how something could absorb that kind of punishment and remain standing. The crowd erupted with an energy that bordered on frenzy. Lord Hilbert laughed with obvious delight, impressed by how far this particular challenger had pushed things, and curious to see how much further it could go. He raised an artifact he was holding and cast a spell through it. Dorgan responded immediately, his movements becoming noticeably faster than before. Ashley recognized the shift and warned Daisuke at once. Dorgan's focus had locked entirely onto him. Daisuke saw it too. He said he needed to put distance between himself and Dorgan and started running. Ashley and Rena called after him, wanting to know what he was planning. Daisuke told them he had an idea and kept moving. Dorgan pursued him without hesitation, closing the gap quickly and reaching out to grab him. Daisuke twisted away from the grasp and maneuvered himself into a position directly in front of Dorgan, face to face with him at extremely close range. With Dorgan's head right in front of him, Daisuke pressed the barrel forward and fired point blank at his helmet. The impact drove Dorgan straight into the ground. The fighters still in the arena erupted in cheering. Ashley shouted that he had done it. Daisuke explained his reasoning to the others as he turned and walked back toward them. The shotgun had not been capable of doing meaningful damage to Dorgan's body, even with live rounds, but targeting the head directly at that range meant the shock transferred straight through the helmet to the brain. A concussion of that force would render a person unconscious regardless of how physically hardened the rest of the body had become. No amount of physical conditioning or regeneration magic could train the brain to withstand that kind of impact. Dorgan would not be getting up for some time. Then Daisuke looked behind him. Dorgan was already rising. His body was regenerating as he moved, tissue knitting back together, even as he straightened up. Daisuke barely had time to register it before Dorgan's fist came flying at him. He threw himself sideways, just in time to avoid it. Daisuke fired at Dorgan again, but this time the shots had no effect at all. He could not understand it. A direct hit to the head had put Dorgan down moments ago, and yet here, he was moving as though nothing had happened. Before Daisuke could process it further, Dorgan swung his arm and connected squarely, sending Daisuke crashing hard into the ground. Lord Hilbert watched from above with renewed excitement as Daisuke went down. Then something unexpected happened. Dorgan's helmet slipped from his head and dropped slowly to the ground. What was revealed beneath it stopped everyone in the arena cold. Dorgan's face was not a face at all. It was cracked and broken like shattered stone. Rena stated what she was seeing plainly, and the warriors around her reached the same horrified conclusion. Dorgan was not human. Ashley reflected aloud on the fact that they had been fighting that thing the whole time, without knowing what it was. Lord Hilbert burst out laughing and told them all that they had finally figured out, making clear that a being like Dorgan could never have been human to begin with. Dorgan was a living construct, a stone golem animated and sustained by his own life force. The crowd murmured among themselves as the truth settled over them. One of Hilbert's subordinates approached him and suggested they stop the match immediately, pointing out that they had reached a dangerous threshold. Without the helmet, the golem had reverted to its base strength, and at that level there was a real risk of casualties spreading beyond the arena floor to the spectators themselves. Hilbert turned the concern back on the subordinate with casual indifference, seemingly unbothered by the prospect entirely. The subordinate was visibly shaken by the response. The stone golem was a creature of immense and almost incomprehensible physical power, a giant formed from boulders, possessing no sense of self, with strength that dwarfed anything a human fighter could bring to bear and a defensive capability that bordered on absolute. Inside the arena, one of the warriors had already thrown himself to the ground, surrendering completely and begging for the match to be stopped, pleading to be allowed to leave. The golem swung at him anyway, and he barely got out of the way before a deafening impact shook the ground where he had been lying. The explosion of force from the blow sent cracks radiating outward. Someone in the crowd screamed for everyone to run before they were killed, and panic began rippling through the stands. Daisuke was still lying unconscious on the arena floor. The elderly woman from the eatery, watching from the stands in horror, screamed at the group to stop what they were doing and run for their lives. Rena refused. She stated firmly that retreating was not an option. They could not allow the golem to continue its rampage unchecked. Ashley agreed, adding the more practical point that leaving meant losing the prize. Rena's expression shifted from determination to outright fury as the reality of what the golem had done to Daisuke settled over her. She clenched her sword, charged at the golem, and attacked. The golem continued its destruction without pause, sending warriors who tried to intervene flying through the air with a single sweep of its arm, as though they weighed nothing. The fighters who had not yet fled admitted to each other that there was simply no way to win against it. Ashley assessed the situation with growing alarm. A golem was the last thing she had expected, and the one person she had been counting on to turn the tide was currently face down on the ground. She was also aware that she had no way to get to Ethan and help him over the walls to escape. The golem continued its rampage, picking up warriors and hurling them through the air, while Lord Hilbert watched from above with barely contained joy, savoring the sight of overwhelming power crushing everything beneath it. On the arena floor, a knight who had survived the chaos made his way to Daisuke and checked on him, relieved to find him still alive. As Daisuke began to regain consciousness, the knight quickly filled him in on what had unfolded after he had been knocked out. The revelation that the enormous fighter they had been battling was in fact a golem. Daisuke took in the scene around him and then, without explanation, reached his arm through the portal connected to his closet and began searching for something inside it. The knight stared at what he was seeing and could not begin to understand what was happening. Above them, Hilbert was past caring about anything other than spectacle. He commanded the golem to attack everyone, to kill every single person in the arena without exception. Rena threw herself at the golem again and slashed at it, but the creature deflected her attack effortlessly and the force of it drove her into the ground. Ashley rushed in to help her up and tried to attack from a different angle. Hilbert watched from his perch and laughed with enormous satisfaction, declaring that nothing could stop his golem and that any effort against it was completely useless. Then a thunderous bang rang out through the arena. The golem's arm shattered and exploded outward in pieces. The shockwave of it left everyone frozen. Ashley, the remaining warriors, the crowd, and even Lord Hilbert himself, who stared down at the arena in disbelief. He cried out over the destruction of his golem, unable to comprehend what had just happened as more of the creature's body began to come apart in a series of explosions. The smoke that filled the arena began to thin. Across the floor on the far side, Daisuke and the knight came into view. Daisuke was stretched out flat on the ground, pressed to the scope of a sniper rifle he had retrieved from the portal. Rena and Ashley stared at him in stunned relief. Daisuke noted to himself that the first shot had not been a clean hit, given that it was his first time handling this particular weapon. But he was already adjusting his aim, steady through the scope, targeting the golem with full focus. He told himself, and anyone close enough to hear, that the next shot would not miss. Hilbert stared down at the arena in disbelief, unable to accept that Daisuke was still alive and functioning. He did not understand what weapon the man had used, but he could see plainly that it was capable of dealing real damage to his golem. He wasted no time, commanding the golem to go directly for Daisuke and finish him. The golem charged. Daisuke lay flat on the ground, already lining up his next shot, and fired the moment the golem was in his sights. The golem's arm was torn completely away from its body in a thunderous explosion. The sound of the shot echoed through the entire arena and left everyone momentarily stunned. Hilbert screamed in anguish over the damage to his creation. The other warriors in the arena stared in open disbelief, unable to identify what kind of weapon could do something like that. The armored knight beside Daisuke told him he had known from the moment he saw him that he was no ordinary person, strange outfit and all, and demanded to know what the long pipe-like device actually was. Daisuke explained that it was a Barrett M82, a 50 caliber anti-material rifle. The weapon had been designed specifically to penetrate targets that conventional assault rifles and machine guns could not reach. It carried enough stopping power to disable armored vehicles and even attack helicopters. Hilbert raged from above, declaring that Daisuke was unforgivable and that he would see the man dead no matter what. The golem was groaning from the damage it had sustained, but continued, driving forward. Rena called out to Daisuke in warning, but he was already moving, steadying the rifle and firing again, this time targeting the golem's legs. The shot landed and both legs shattered instantly, dropping the golem to the ground in a crashing heap. Hilbert's fury reached a new pitch. The warriors around the arena could not believe what they were witnessing, and the disbelief gave way to something like elation. Ashley declared openly that Daisuke was truly extraordinary. Rena exhaled with relief and moved to check on him. Daisuke let out a pained groan. Herodias noticed the state he was in, injured from the hit he had taken from the golem earlier, and was struck by the realization that Daisuke had been fighting in that condition the whole time. Daisuke asked him to help him up. Herodias moved immediately to support him. Ashley surveyed the arena. By any reasonable measure, there was no question about who had won. Rena glanced at the warriors nearby, alert to whether any of them intended to make a move against Daisuke in his weakened state. Ashley made clear they would step up to face anyone who tried. The warriors quickly indicated they had no such intention. Simply by watching what had unfolded, they knew Daisuke was in an entirely different category from anyone else in that arena. One of them quietly admitted that knowing someone like that existed in the world unsettled him deeply. Then Hilbert, consumed by rage and refusing to accept the outcome, shouted a spell toward the golem. Rena and the others tensed as the fragments began to reassemble. One of Hilbert's own subordinates shouted at him to stop, warning that what he was doing was reckless to the point of madness. The golem was an original creation produced by a master sorcerer named Grimm, using the most advanced techniques available to their country. Any attempt to reconstruct it through brute magical force would not restore what it had been. It would produce something dangerous and fundamentally unstable. Hilbert ignored the warning entirely. The broken pieces of the golem that were scattered across the arena floor began to rise into the air and drift back together. Everyone watching was horrified. The warriors in the arena cried out that the match was already over and that forcing this to continue was completely unfair. They demanded the prize be awarded and that they be allowed to leave. Hilbert made clear he no longer cared about the tournament at all. His only remaining objective was killing Daisuke. Rena turned to Daisuke and told him to leave the rest of them. Ashley was caught off guard at being included without being asked, But before she could fully object, Herodias laughed and stepped forward, announcing himself to the reforming Golem and declaring his intention to face it. He took one look at the reconstructing creature and quickly revised his opinion, deciding in the same breath that this was well beyond reckless. He turned around, scooped Daisuke up, and put him on his back, and told him they were getting out of there. He warned Daisuke it was going to hurt and told him to hold on, then sprinted away from the Golem's position. As they ran, Herodias noted that the only thing that had actually worked against the Golem had been Daisuke's weapon, and that fighting it in his current condition was not something Daisuke could realistically do. Someone spotted a section of broken wall and pointed it out as a way to get outside the arena. Ashley found Ethan and told him to take the others and go through the opening. Ethan asked whether she was coming with them. Ashley smiled and told him she was not. There were people here she could not walk away from. She told him to go, reminding him that his mother was waiting for him and to make sure he stayed safe. The Golem drove a massive fist into the ground exactly where Daisuke and Herodias had been standing moments before. Hilbert laughed at the top of his voice, taunting them to run as far as they wanted. Ashley turned to Lena and laid out what she had worked out. She did not believe the Golem was targeting Daisuke on its own initiative. She was certain it was Hilbert directing it, which meant that if Hilbert lost sight of Daisuke, the Golem's focus would break and they could buy enough time for Daisuke to get clear. Lena said she understood and that she would do everything she could. Then Lena paused and looked at Ashley with something softer in her expression, telling her that despite everything, she had turned out to be a genuinely good person. Ashley told her to stop talking and go, visibly flustered by the remark. She muttered to herself that she had no desire to do what she was about to do, but that there was no other way. A brilliant light enveloped her. She raised both arms and called upon something ancient, invoking a cursed crest and the terms of contract, bidding it to grant her the power she needed. At the same moment, Lena charged toward Hilbert's position and unleashed her sonic zapper directly at the wall below him. Hilbert was startled but recovered quickly into contemptuous amusement, asking why an imbecile knight thought she could threaten him from down on the arena floor. He told her not to worry. Once he had dealt with Daisuke, she would be next. Then Hilbert's attention snapped to something that was wrong. He looked around the arena, demanding to know where Daisuke had gone. Before anyone could respond, a heavy impact shook the ground of the arena. The sound had stopped everyone cold. Warriors looked around frantically, asking each other what was making that noise and whether something else was coming. Through the rising dust and smoke, a silhouette took shape. A second Dorgan-like creature rose from the ground and stood in the arena. Silence fell over everyone who witnessed it. Eyes wide, minds struggling to accept what they were seeing. Hilbert's composure shattered. He demanded to know what this meant and how there could possibly be another Dorgan standing in his arena. Lena turned to Ashley, asking whether this was her doing, and stared at her with a look of complete astonishment, wondering who and what Ashley actually was. The giant Golem let out a tremendous roar as it faced Dorgan in the arena. Everyone watching was stunned and unable to believe what they were seeing. Lord Hilbert was beside himself with disbelief, insisting that it was impossible because there was only one Dorgan and it belonged to him alone, so there was simply no way another one could exist. The Golem hurled massive rocks at Dorgan, and the warriors inside the arena scrambled desperately to avoid the flying debris. People screamed and fled in every direction, pulling others along with them in the panic. Lena was swept up in the crowd and dragged away from the fighting. Ashley was left standing alone on the battlefield. Chunks of flying rock came dangerously close to striking her, but she kept her focus and held her ground, facing the Golem without retreating. The scene shifted back to her past, to the village where she had grown up. Someone had cried out in alarm about the cursed crest. An elf reported to the village elder that a person bearing the cursed crest had just appeared among them. The people of the village gathered and murmured among themselves, their eyes fixed on one woman whose face had suddenly developed strange markings without any warning or explanation. The elder called for calm and then delivered the community's judgment. There was nothing to be done for someone bearing the cursed crest other than to drive them from a land. The elder said that cursed ones would inevitably bring misfortune upon everyone around them. He directed his words at Ashley, asking whether she understood what he was telling her. One of the women threw water in Ashley's face and told her it was a disgrace that the cursed crest had appeared in their household. She called Ashley ungrateful and demanded she leave immediately. Ashley stood there with her face wet and her expression devastated. She was what was known as a cursed one, an affliction that arose rarely from an ancient curse that had long been part of elven history. She had simply been unlucky enough to be the one it fell upon. The experience had taught her something she carried with her from that day forward. She had learned never to fully trust another person's kindness, because the moment something went wrong or became inconvenient for them, they would cut her off and discard her without hesitation. Sometime after being cast out, Ashley was sitting alone on a street with a dangerously high fever, barely able to keep herself upright. A woman passing by noticed her condition and asked with concern whether she was all right. Ashley told the woman not to trouble herself over her. Then she collapsed entirely, her body giving out from the fever. When she woke up, she found herself inside a room. An elderly woman was watching over her and expressed warm relief that the fever had finally broken. Ashley looked at the woman and immediately asked with guarded suspicion what the woman wanted from her and what her intentions were in helping her. The elderly woman said it had simply been the impulse of an old woman, nothing more deliberate than that. She then shared something painful. Her son had been taken into the coliseum, and she had no way of knowing how he was faring in there. There was nothing she could do to help him from where she stood. She said that if she could gather 50 gold pieces, she would be able to secure his release from the coliseum, and she believed it was the hard work she had been doing toward that goal that had somehow led her to this moment of meeting Ashley. Ashley was deeply affected by hearing this. She asked the woman how many years she thought it would realistically take for an elderly woman to gather that amount on her own. The elderly woman acknowledged that she knew it was likely beyond what she was physically capable of achieving, but said that her son was the sole reason she was still alive and still fighting to get through each day. As long as he could come home, nothing else mattered to her. Her voice broke as she spoke, and tears began to fall as she said how much she missed her son Ethan. Ashley watched the old woman weeping for her child whom she refused to stop loving and could not bring herself to let go of. The sight of it stirred something deep and painful in Ashley. She thought of the elves in her village who had cast her out without mercy. She made a decision. She told the elderly woman that she would bring her son back. No matter what it took, she would find a way to get the 50 gold pieces, and the woman should trust her to do it. The elderly woman was moved and asked why Ashley would go to such lengths for a stranger. Ashley asked only one thing in return. She made the woman promise that when her son came home, she would hold him without saying a single word. Just hold him. She said that no matter what happened in life or what people had done wrong, there should always be someone in the world who would never let go of them. She thought of her own parents who had not gone to that length for her, and that was precisely why she felt so strongly about it. Back in the present moment in the arena, the golem drove its fist hard into Dorgan's face. Ashley suddenly dropped to her knees on the ground and thought quietly to herself that this appeared to be the end. At that same moment, the illusion of Dorgan that had been fighting suddenly vanished entirely. Hilbert stared at the second Dorgan, standing in his arena, and worked it out. It was nothing but an illusion. The golem had been fighting something that did not physically exist. He rounded on Ashley with fury, accusing her of tricking him. Ashley explained herself without apology. Those who bore the cursed crest were granted a unique ability in exchange for the burden placed upon them. Her gift was the power of image projection. Once she had seen something, she could conjure a perfect visual copy of it. Rocks, smoke, an entire creature. Anything she had witnessed, she could replicate as an illusion. While Hilbert had been standing there consumed by rage and confusion, every person who needed to escape had done so. Ashley laughed at him openly, finding genuine satisfaction in how completely he had been outmaneuvered. Hilbert's fury reached a point beyond reason. He screamed at Ashley, calling her worthless for daring to look down on him, and commanded the golem to seize her. The golem's massive hand closed around her body and lifted her off the ground. Hilbert declared he would crush her to death, and that she could cry and scream as much as she liked. Trapped in the golem's grip, Ashley's thoughts went somewhere quieter. She wondered whether Ethan had made it back to his mother. Then she thought of Daisuke, and of the moment Lena had told her, with complete sincerity, that she was actually a good person. To have encountered people of genuine kindness before the end, she thought to herself, it had not been a bad life. She had made her peace with it. Then Daisuke's voice cut through the arena, calling out to her and asking if she was all right. Ashley's eyes snapped open in shock. A thunderous shot rang out, and the golem's arm was blown apart. Ashley dropped free and hit the ground hard. Daisuke was still there, standing in the arena, calling out to the golem directly and telling it to face him and settle things once and for all. Hilbert was incandescent with rage at the sight of Daisuke, still alive and standing. Heribodius, supporting Daisuke beside him, warned urgently that Daisuke had developed a fever from his broken bones and could not hold out much longer. Ashley looked at Daisuke through eyes that had filled with tears, completely unable to understand why he had come back for her in the state he was in. Even knowing what it would cost him physically, he had not abandoned her. The question stayed with her without an answer. Daisuke fired at the golem again. Heribodius kept him upright while he steadied his aim. The shot landed and the damaged boulders that made up the golem's body began drifting back into position, regenerating exactly as they had before. Hilbert watched with vicious satisfaction, announcing that he had known it. As long as his magical power held, the golem would regenerate without limit, piece by piece returning to where it had been. He called Daisuke reckless and savored what he believed was an unwinnable situation. Heribodius leaned close to Daisuke and told him something critical. During the fighting, he had caught a glimpse of something inside the golem's body. A small statuette. He was certain it was the core that powered the entire creature. After so much of the surrounding stone had been blasted away, it had finally become visible. Daisuke seized on this immediately, recognizing it as the weakness they had been looking for. Ashley called out from nearby, alarmed. Before they could act on it, Heribodius shouted a warning. Something was incoming. A massive chunk of debris came hurtling toward them, and Heribodius threw himself over Daisuke to shield him from the impact of the flying rocks. Outside the arena walls, people were already trying to make sense of what they had been hearing. News had spread that Dorgan was not human at all. Then, those gathered outside noticed something happening high above them, somewhere near the top of the arena structure. The sounds had changed in a way that nobody could explain, and before anyone could react, a tremendous explosion shook everything. People screamed and scattered. Something was falling from above. At the top of the arena, the golem had crashed down near Daisuke and Herodias, destroying the exit in the process. It loomed over them and declared in its way that there was no escape now, that it had finally cornered them, and that the victory was its. Herodias asked Daisuke what his plan was. Daisuke told him to stay calm. He had already assessed the structure around them. The surface they were on could not support the golem's weight. The architecture simply was not built for something that heavy. Almost as he said it, the ground beneath the golem began to give way. Cracks spread, and the floor crumbled under the enormous mass pressing down on it. The golem broke through and began sinking into the hole it had created, trapped by its own weight, unable to generate enough leverage to pull itself free. It sank deeper, movement becoming increasingly impossible. Herodias told Daisuke to aim for the statuette. He told him with full conviction that he could do it. Daisuke steadied himself, focused everything he had left through the scope of the rifle, and fired. The shot found its mark. The golem came apart, its stone body fragmenting and separating into pieces that tumbled down from the top of the arena and crashed to the ground below. The threat was finished. Daisuke lowered the rifle and adjusted his eyepiece in the stillness that followed, composed and unhurried, carrying himself with the quiet ease of an action hero stepping out of the final scene of a film. The golem crashed to the ground and broke apart into pieces. The warriors who had witnessed the entire fight stood in stunned silence before the reality of what had just happened settled over them, and the silence gave way to open amazement. People expressed their disbelief and admiration freely, struggling to find words adequate enough to describe what Daisuke had just accomplished. Ashley sprinted toward Daisuke the moment the threat was gone. He was on the ground, breathing hard, clearly running on the last of whatever he had left. She was visibly shaken with worry and demanded to know why he had come back for her when she had given him a clear chance to escape. Daisuke managed a small laugh through his labored breathing and told her simply that he was not the kind of person who could leave someone behind. He said he was glad she was safe. Ashley looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between happiness and exasperation, and told him through eyes that were glistening that he was an absolute idiot. She and Herodias moved to either side of him and helped him to his feet. As the three of them made their way forward, the crowd that had gathered spotted them. A cheer went up that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daisuke was caught completely off guard by the reception. The crowd had given him a name, the Golem Slayer, and the title spread through the people like a wave of energy. Before Daisuke could find his footing in the moment, Herodias threw his arm up and addressed the crowd directly, announcing that the golem had been defeated and that the danger had passed. The crowd erupted again. The elderly woman from the eatery pushed through to reach Daisuke, addressing him by his new title and pouring her gratitude into every word. She told him her husband had come home safely because of what he had done. The crowd picked up the name and began chanting it, calling out for the Golem Slayer again and again. Daisuke tried to cut through the noise, asking everyone to stop and introducing himself properly, Koga Daisuke, and nothing more than an ordinary salaryman. The elderly woman was visibly startled, asking whether that was truly his occupation, and apologized on behalf of everyone for any disrespect. Then someone in the crowd picked up the new title and called out to him as Sir Salaryman instead. The name caught on immediately, spreading through the crowd with the same energy the previous one had carried. Daisuke looked at everyone cheering and calling him that, and finally gave up trying to correct them, letting a smile break through despite himself. Herodias addressed him with a quiet seriousness beneath his usual bluster, telling him that it was entirely natural for ordinary people to look to the strong for protection. The true meaning of being a hero, he said, lay in responding to those hopes with genuine kindness. Daisuke had earned the right to walk with his head held high. Rena made her way to them and immediately checked on Daisuke, then turned her concern to Ashley as well. Daisuke told her he was relieved to see her safe. Rena confirmed that she was, thanks to him, but acknowledged that none of them were exactly in good condition at the moment. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. A sharp voice cut across the crowd, ordering everyone to stop. Lord Hilbert appeared with his guards at his side, his face contorted with rage. He demanded to know how Daisuke had dared to destroy his golem and immediately declared him a traitor to the country, ordering the guards to seize him without delay. The guards stopped where they were and did not move. Hilbert looked around at them, unable to understand why his command was not being carried out, and pressed them to act. Then something struck him in the face. A mug. He spun around demanding to know who had thrown it, threatening prison time for treason. A voice from the crowd shouted back at him to go ahead and try it. The speaker reminded Hilbert loudly that they had a Sir Salaryman among them who had just destroyed his golem with his bare hands, and invited Hilbert to bring whatever he had. The guards exchanged looks with each other and stayed where they were. Before Hilbert could escalate further, one of his own subordinates rushed to him with urgent news. The citizens who had long been suffering under his rule had surrounded the mansion. Hilbert demanded to have it repeated, unable to absorb what he was hearing. He looked around and saw that the crowd had grown bolder. Objects began flying in his direction: mugs, vegetables, an empty barrel. The people's voices rose together, laying out their grievances plainly. The city had once been properly governed by a mayor, and their lives had functioned. Ever since Hilbert had been installed as ruler, everything had deteriorated. If the city was going to be handed over to outside authority, the very least they deserved was someone fit to govern it. They told him with unambiguous force to get out of their city. Hilbert's subordinate leaned in and urged him urgently to retreat. If they stayed any longer, the situation would only get worse. Hilbert did not wait to hear more. He turned and ran for his carriage, shouting at the coachman to leave immediately. His subordinates scrambled after him, calling for him to wait as he left them behind. Inside the carriage as it pulled away, Hilbert pressed himself into the seat and looked back through the window at the crowd, at Daisuke, at everything that had just unraveled. He cursed the salaryman through clenched teeth, declaring with bitter fury that he would never forget the humiliation of this day. Hilbert's carriage disappeared from sight as fast as the horses could carry it, and the moment it was gone the crowd erupted. People celebrated openly, declaring that Hilbert's reign over their city was finished and that they were finally free. The relief and joy that had been suppressed for so long poured out of everyone at once. In the middle of the celebrating crowd, a reunion was taking place. Ethan spotted his mother and called out to her. She turned and the sight of him hit her like a wave. She was overwhelmed to see him standing there alive and unhurt. Ethan told her that someone inside the coliseum had helped him, an elf, though he was not sure where she had gone. His mother's eyes filled with tears as the memory of a promise came back to her. Ashley had spoken to her before everything had unfolded and had told her simply to hold her son without saying anything when she saw him again. She had kept her word. Ethan's mother pulled him into her arms and held him tightly. Not far away, Ashley had seen the reunion. She watched it for a moment with a quiet smile, then turned and walked on without drawing attention to herself. Later, once the chaos of the arena had settled, the business of the prize was concluded. A guard presented the winnings, 100 gold coins, with a heavy clank of the bag hitting the surface. Daisuke looked at it with mild uncertainty, noting that even if they accepted it, spending that amount of money was going to be a practical challenge. Ashley immediately reminded everyone that she had been promised exactly 50 gold coins as her share of the arrangement, and she was not about to let that go. Rena turned to Daisuke and asked him to hold on to the remaining 50, pointing out that they would need funds available at various points ahead, and adding with a pointed look that there was no telling whether someone might relieve her of it again in the near future. Daisuke understood the logic and agreed to store it securely inside his closet where it could not be taken. Ashley's eyes lit up at the mention of the money, and she suggested with a grin that he hand it all to her instead so she could double it at a casino. Rena shut this idea down before it could go any further, firmly telling Daisuke that under no circumstances should he give Ashley any of it. Herodias approached Daisuke and addressed him with a formal gravity that seemed to come naturally to him, announcing that what he had witnessed had genuinely captured his interest and respect. He introduced himself properly as Herodias III and declared that from this day forward, he recognized Daisuke as someone worthy of his deepest admiration. Daisuke shook his hand and was struck by how ceremoniously polite the man was. He introduced himself in return and handed over one of his business cards, identifying himself as section chief of the design planning division at Tsukida Trading Limited, Koga Daisuke. Herodias examined the card with wide eyes, noting that the writing on it was unlike anything he had ever seen before in his life. Before the moment could settle, a man nearby noticed the state of Daisuke's legs and moved in with urgency, pointing out that the wounds needed immediate treatment. Daisuke let out a sharp sound of pain at being examined and told the man he needed to go and that the wounds would heal on their own. He reached for the portal door, opened it, and stepped halfway through. Everyone nearby stared at the door in complete bewilderment. Ashley asked what it was, some kind of teleportation magic. Daisuke waved at all of them and said he would be back. Rena told him they would be waiting. He stepped through fully and the door vanished as instantly as it had appeared, leaving nothing behind. Herodias looked at the empty space where it had been and remarked to himself that Daisuke was, without any doubt, a profoundly strange individual. Then Rena remembered something. She turned to Ashley with a look that made the question obvious before she even formed it. Ashley smiled back at her, perfectly aware of what was coming: Rena's wallet. On the other side of the portal, Daisuke stepped into his closet and immediately noticed something remarkable. The pain in his legs was gone. The wounds had healed completely. The memory of what the goddess had told him surfaced, that every time he passed through the teleportation gate, any injuries, exhaustion, or illness he was carrying would be fully restored. She had told him to make sure he came back whenever he was hurt or worn down, before returning to the other world. He was grateful for it. Back at his workplace, his colleagues noticed, as they had been noticing for some time now, that he seemed to be in excellent spirits. Far away, in the Gurnia Empire, a very different atmosphere prevailed. Hilbert had returned and stood before several powerful figures, head lowered in submission, offering repeated apologies for what had transpired. One of those present, a woman, spoke with cool detachment, noting that she had heard everything, that the golem which had been entrusted to him was gone. An elderly man added that according to the reports that had reached them, a single individual was responsible for its destruction. The woman turned back to Hilbert and suggested with barely concealed contempt that if he was going to offer an explanation, he might as well make it one that was worth believing. Hilbert insisted with visible desperation that he was not lying. The person in question had identified himself as a salaryman, and the weapons he carried defied any reasonable explanation. They were unlike anything Hilbert had ever encountered and held power that should not have been possible. One of the others in the room reflected that the term salaryman meant nothing to any of them. It was an occupation none of them had ever heard of. The king in the room absorbed everything that had been said and then spoke. He called forward a figure known as the Black Knight Zal and gave him a single directive: find this man and bring him in. The Black Knight acknowledged the order without hesitation. Out at sea, a ship was making its way across the open water when an enormous tentacle broke the surface without warning. The crew scrambled to fight back against the sea creature, but the tentacle coiled around the hull of the ship and dragged it steadily downward into the deep. It was one of many strange and unsettling phenomena that had been appearing across different places over the course of several weeks, each one unexplained and deeply troubling. Back in a busy port city, life had taken on a different shape for Lena and Ashley. Ashley had taken up work at a local establishment, serving customers in a waitress outfit, while Lena worked alongside her. Ashley moved through the tables with her usual easy confidence, setting down orders and exchanging quick words with the customers, many of whom made no secret of the fact that her presence was a large part of why they kept coming back. She took their enthusiasm in stride and reminded them cheerfully that if they intended to return so often, they had better make it worth the establishment's while. In quieter moments between customers, the two of them caught up. Lena admitted that working in a place like this, surrounded by people passing through from all directions, had seemed like a promising way to pick up information about Oliver. She had hoped that someone among the steady flow of travelers and locals might know something. So far, nothing had come of it. Ashley deflected from the topic with a teasing remark, steering the conversation toward Daisuke and wondering aloud whether he had a girlfriend yet. Lena said with mild irritation that she had no idea, and turned the question back on Ashley, asking why she had decided to take up work there in the first place. She pointed out that Ashley still had 50 gold coins from the Coliseum prize and should have had no financial need to work. Ashley's response was entirely without remorse. She had spent all of it on the very day they had received it, every last coin, lost at the casino. Lena could barely believe what she was hearing. Ashley moved on from the topic smoothly, adding that she had noticed Daisuke had a habit of turning up wherever she happened to be. If she stayed close to Lena, she figured it was only a matter of time before they crossed paths with him again. Lena let the logic sit, then said quietly that she hoped he was all right, given how serious his injuries had been. Ashley's expression shifted into something softer, and with a slight flush in her cheeks, she said that since Daisuke had fought for her sake, when they met again, it would be her turn to take care of him. Lena immediately took issue with this framing, pointing out that Daisuke had fought on behalf of everyone, not for Ashley specifically. Ashley insisted with complete conviction that she was wrong. He had done it for her. Their back and forth was interrupted when a man at a nearby table spoke up. He said he had heard them talking and asked whether they were searching for a certain knight. They both turned toward him. Lena confirmed that they were, and the three of them settled down together to talk properly. The man said he believed he had encountered someone who matched what they were looking for, a fighter whose swordsmanship bore a striking resemblance to Lena's own style. Lena asked immediately whether it had been Oliver, barely containing her reaction. The man shook his head and said unfortunately he had not known the knight's name at the time. He also wanted to take the opportunity to thank them, since it was because of what had happened at the Coliseum that he had been freed. He then shared what he remembered. About 6 months ago, a group of violent thugs had been running rampant through the city. Out of nowhere, a lone knight had appeared and taken every single one of them down without apparent difficulty. The man recalled the moment vividly. The knight had called out the name of a technique, a sonic zapper, as he drove his blade through the enemies around him. The image had stayed with him clearly. He added that afterward, the knight had been looking for a ship that could take him to a particular dungeon, a destination he described as an uninhabited island located roughly 3 days out from the port, near a place called the Common Channel. On that island sat a dungeon known as Axane Cave. Ashley recognized the name immediately and confirmed it was an extraordinarily dangerous place, densely packed with powerful monsters and avoided by almost everyone who knew of it. The man agreed and said that was precisely why the detail had stuck in his memory. There were almost no travelers willing to go near it. He mentioned as an additional detail that the dungeon was said to hold vast, untouched stores of treasure and rare, powerful items that had never been claimed. Elsewhere, someone was poring over a map and quietly identifying the same location, murmuring to themselves as their finger landed on the right spot and confirming that Axane was indeed the place they were looking for. Back at the establishment, Lena and Ashley changed out of their work clothes and prepared to leave. Lena thanked the owner warmly for having them. The owner told them the place was going to feel empty without them and made sure they heard it clearly. As they gathered themselves to go, Lena looked at Ashley and asked with a slight furrowing of her brows why she was coming along. Ashley reminded her of what she had already said. Daisuke was going to show up wherever she went, and that was reason enough. She added that beyond that, Lena herself had become someone she genuinely wanted to be around. With Lena in her company, she was certain she would never have a dull moment. Lena turned her face away to hide the warmth that rose in her expression, muttering that it was a nuisance. But then she turned back, smiled, and told Ashley to come along with her. Together the two of them made their way to the port. The ordered away anchor rang out across the ship, followed immediately by the call to unfurl the sails. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, and within moments the ship was cutting smoothly away from the port and out toward the open water. A final departure call echoed across the deck as the coastline began to fall behind them. Lena stood at the railing and watched the sea spread out before her, the wind catching her hair, her expression full of a quiet and genuine joy at the feeling of it. A crew member interrupted her appreciation of the moment, asking in a skeptical tone whether both she and Ashley were truly intending to go to that island. Lena confirmed it without hesitation. The captain began going through the practical details of the journey. They would make a temporary stop at the uninhabited harbor, which would make the total round trip 6 days, and he was cut off mid-sentence by a sudden flash of light on the deck. A pair of shoes materialized out of nowhere, and then Daisuke stepped out of the portal, looking around with a bright and easy smile. He took in a view of the open sea and reacted with visible excitement. The captain stared at him with complete bewilderment, demanding to know where on earth he had come from and how he had gotten onto the ship. Before Daisuke could respond, both Ashley and Lena had already rushed over to him. Lena's excitement was immediately tempered by concern as she asked whether his wounds had properly healed. Daisuke assured her they had and told her not to worry. The captain had recovered enough to remember practical matters and raised his voice again, pointing out with considerable agitation that this person was not on the passenger list and that his sudden appearance was creating a problem. Daisuke immediately apologized and offered to pay the fare on the spot. The captain then pointed out a secondary issue. Meals had only been prepared for the passengers on the list. He asked whether Daisuke would manage with preserved rations. Daisuke said he was completely fine and produced food he had brought from a convenience store back in his own world. The captain stared at the word he had used, repeating it slowly to himself with a baffled expression, clearly having no frame of reference for it. When Daisuke unpacked what he had brought, the men nearby gathered around and stared at the food with wide eyes, unable to identify what any of it was or what it might be made of. Someone described it as a refined and unfamiliar dish. Daisuke told them with some awkwardness that it was his dinner and politely asked them not to eat it. As things settled, Lena told Daisuke that she believed she had finally found a genuine lead on Oliver's whereabouts, and she filled him in on everything the man at the eatery had shared with them. They spent time afterward simply enjoying the view as the ship moved further from land. Daisuke pulled out his phone and took a picture of the scenery, an action that puzzled everyone who noticed. Evening came on gradually. When Daisuke registered that it was already nighttime, he mentioned that he needed to head back, given that they still had 3 more days of sailing ahead. Ashley reacted with open disappointment. Before leaving, he handed them something he had received from a colleague back home as a souvenir, and the men nearby exclaimed with delight at the unfamiliar item. He stepped back toward the portal to return. Then a crew member burst in from the deck, voice urgent and alarmed, telling the captain that something was wrong and pulling him to come immediately. Out on the deck, the crew had already formed up, their eyes fixed on something in the dark water. When the captain and the others arrived, someone called for light to be cast over the water. The shape that the light revealed prompted immediate confusion. It looked somewhat like a lizard man, but someone quickly pointed out that lizard men could not survive underwater. The captain reasoned aloud that what they were looking at was something else entirely, a creature capable of living both in the water and outside of it. He wasted no time, warning the crew that it would be extremely dangerous to allow it to board the ship. The creature struck without warning. The crew cried out as it came at them. Lena was already moving, stepping forward and bringing her sword through in a sharp technique she called Sky Slash. The tentacle recoiled from the impact. She immediately checked that the crew member nearby had not been hurt. He stammered his thanks, but before anyone could regroup, more tentacles broke the surface. Not one, but 2 more sets appearing on another side of the ship. The crew's alarm escalated rapidly as they tried to count what they were dealing with, the numbers seeming to grow with each moment. The captain's voice cut through the panic, ordering all hands to the deck and calling on the crew to stand firm. Daisuke appeared with a gun in his hand, announcing that he and Lena would help. The captain looked at the weapon with confusion, but told him firmly that while he understood the impulse, fighting monsters at sea was the crew's responsibility, and passengers needed to stay inside the cabin for their own safety. Out on the deck, one of the crew members was struggling against a tentacle in the darkness, unable to see well enough to fight effectively, shouting in frustration and fear about what these things were. Men shouted in terror that the ship was capsizing. Then the ship lurched. A powerful force gripped the hull, and the deck tilted sharply, sending men stumbling and grabbing for anything fixed to stay upright. The angle worsened. The captain's eyes swept the water, and something shifted in his expression, the recognition of something far worse than what he had initially assumed. These were not separate creatures attacking from different angles. It was one. A single entity of enormous scale had risen from the sea around them. The captain's voice dropped before it rose again in a shout of pure dread. It was the Kraken. The crew stood frozen on the tilting deck, staring upward at the vast shape that had surfaced from the deep, its mass dwarfing the ship entirely. The Kraken rose from the depths in its full and terrible size, a colossal creature with countless appendages that broke the surface and sent the ship's crew into immediate panic. It lashed out without warning, driving a tentacle toward the people on deck, and the men threw themselves out of the way just in time. The captain called out for everyone to stay alert, reminding them that this was not an ordinary sea monster. The crew took in the sheer scale of it in horror, and someone made the grim connection that this creature was likely responsible for the growing number of ships that had been found sunk across the region. The order went out to repel every tentacle. Rena drove her sword into the nearest tentacle and felt her stomach drop. The blade barely registered against the creature's flesh, bouncing back as though she had struck something with the wrong side entirely. She could not cut it. Daisuke held his ground and opened fire on the Kraken, but the creature did not even react to the shots. He acknowledged quietly that the weapon he had used was not getting through. The ship tilted further under the Kraken's grip, and everything that was not fixed to the deck, barrels, crates, and crew members, began sliding and tumbling. Loose cargo went over the side and splashed into the water below. The captain shouted above the noise, warning everyone not to fall overboard. Down in the cabin, a girl who had been sleeping was thrown off her bunk as the ship lurched. Her head struck the floor, and she came up annoyed and disoriented, immediately assuming the captain had simply lost control of the ship. She grabbed her robe and marched toward the door in a foul mood. Back on deck, the fighting continued with limited effect. Rena shouted her thanks to Daisuke after he stepped in to help, smoke still curling from the barrel of his shotgun. He muttered to himself that even the shotgun, which he considered reliable in close quarters, was as useless as everything else at this range against something of that size. The cabin door behind them banged open, and the girl stepped out into the chaos. She took one look at the Kraken, and the color left her face. The captain told her immediately to get back inside, but her attention had already locked onto the tentacles moving toward her. Under her breath, she called on the mana within her body, shaping it into fire. A blazing sphere formed at the tip of her staff, and she hurled it forward with full force. The fireball slammed into the Kraken's tentacles and detonated in a burst of flame. The crew stared at the result in open amazement. Fire worked against it. Someone shouted to get the torches ready, and the crew began to pull themselves back together, heartened by the discovery and by the fact that they had a magic user on board. They pointed at the tentacles and called for her to do it again. The girl dropped to the floor with complete exhaustion and explained that the attack had consumed every last bit of her magical power, and she would need time to recover before she could do anything more. Disappointment rolled through the crew. Despite that setback, one of the tentacles had already caught fire, and the captain rallied his men to press the advantage, calling it their answer to the Kraken. Daisuke stood watching and was struck, somewhat absurdly, by the smell of the burning creature. It reminded him of grilled squid from a food stand. The crew attacked with torches, setting flame to the tentacles wherever they could reach. The attack with torches was working on the tentacles, but someone pointed out that they had no way of reaching the Kraken's main body from their position. Ashley agreed, recognizing that the creature was smarter than they had given it credit for and was keeping itself out of effective range. She told everyone to put distance between themselves. Then one of the tentacles coiled around a crew member and hoisted him into the air. He screamed for help. Daisuke fired at the tentacle immediately, and the grip loosened enough for the man to drop free. He checked whether the man was unhurt, and the sailor confirmed he had been saved. Before anyone could recover their footing, another alarm went up. The ship had begun to tilt sharply, and seawater was pouring in. The situation was becoming critical. At the rate things were going, the ship would capsize, and everyone on it would be at the Kraken's mercy. The crew was tipping toward panic and desperation. The captain cut through it with his voice, refusing to let anyone give up, insisting that men of the sea did not simply surrender to a monster and demanding that they think. Daisuke had been looking at something across the water and had an idea forming. He spoke just loud enough for those nearby to hear, pointing out that what he needed was for the fire on that side to stop. The captain stared at what Daisuke was now holding and could not begin to identify it. On the other side of the deck, Rena had made a decision that alarmed Ashley. She was going to go directly for the Kraken's main body and deal damage where it counted. Ashley grabbed her and stopped her, furious and frightened in equal measure, pointing out that anyone who knew anything about the Kraken understood that approach was suicide. Rena acknowledged she knew it was reckless, but argued that they were out of other options. Before either of them could go further, Daisuke's voice carried across the deck, clear and commanding, telling everyone to get back from the Kraken. They both turned, stunned to hear him take control of the moment like that. Daisuke raised the weapon he had retrieved and aimed it at the creature, muttering to himself that under normal circumstances he would not use this at such a close range. But the situation had left him without better choices. A warning shout came from somewhere on deck. He stood firm as the tentacles came for him and pulled the trigger. The impact was enormous. The shot struck the Kraken and detonated, and fire erupted across the creature's head in a blazing explosion. Daisuke immediately registered that the heat had come dangerously close to him. The crew erupted in confused amazement, asking each other what had just happened and whether it was some kind of magic. Daisuke explained the weapon. It was a multiple grenade launcher, an MGL designed to fire 6 consecutive grenade rounds in rapid succession. On impact, the incendiary rounds ignited and set the target ablaze. The Kraken roared with a fury that shook the air. Daisuke recognized with a sinking feeling that he had made the creature significantly angrier. Rena drove her sword into the tentacle closest to him, cutting it back to protect him. Ashley had grabbed hold of a rope and was using it to restrain one of the tentacles, calling for Daisuke to fire again. A crew member beside her added his voice to hers, urging him to take the shot. The Kraken opened its enormous mouth and roared again. Daisuke did not hesitate. He aimed directly into the open mouth and fired. The shot went straight in. The detonation that followed was catastrophic for the creature. Its head exploded from within, and the Kraken collapsed forward into the sea, crashing lifelessly into the water. The crew stood in stunned silence before it broke into disbelieving celebration. They had defeated the Kraken. The captain was barely able to form words. The young mage girl, still sitting on the floor of the deck where she had collapsed, looked at Daisuke with wide eyes and admitted to herself that the man had genuinely held his own. 2 days later, the island came into view. Rena stood at the bow and took it in with quiet intensity, recognizing this as the place Oliver had been heading toward. Daisuke stepped out of his portal at that moment, pleased to find that they had arrived. Rena and Ashley both turned at the sound of him appearing and greeted him with surprised relief. The crew set about unloading water, provisions, and supplies onto the dock, informing the group that they would return in 3 days. As the work was being done, a pair of feet stepped off the ship behind them and a bright, confident voice announced that they had finally arrived. The crew member turned in surprise and asked whether the young woman also had business on the island. She confirmed it without any hesitation. The dungeon on this island existed, as far as she was concerned, for the sole purpose of being conquered by her. The ship pulled away from the island and disappeared into the distance, leaving Daisuke and the 3 young women standing on the shore together. The girl who had stepped off the ship last broke the silence, expressing mild surprise that there were other people with business on the island besides herself. Rena recognized her as the mage from the ship. The girl confirmed this, but made it clear she was no ordinary mage. She introduced herself as Michelle, a prodigy of exceptional talent. Ashley's reaction was openly unimpressed, finding the self-proclamation a bit much. Michelle defended it without any defensiveness, stating plainly that her ability to use every kind of magic was precisely what made the label accurate. She then turned her attention to Daisuke, telling him she had watched him take down the Kraken, and that while she would not go so far as to call him a prodigy, he was quite capable for someone his age. Daisuke responded that he had a feeling the two of them would get along. Ashley immediately corrected Michelle's way of addressing him, and Michelle tried out his actual name, seeming to find it agreeable. Daisuke took the moment to introduce himself properly, apologizing for not having done so sooner. Michelle mentioned that she was there to find the Axane Cave on the island and asked whether Daisuke was there for the same reason. He told her he was there to accompany Rena and Ashley, and also mentioned that he did not actually use magic. This caught Michelle off guard, and she turned the fact over silently, wondering to herself what exactly he had been doing during the Kraken battle, if not magic. Ashley cut into Michelle's thoughts and pointed out that the cave they were heading for had a well-earned reputation for being exceptionally dangerous, and suggested that Michelle, who she described with barely concealed contempt as a spoiled child, might be better off staying home. Michelle ignored the slight entirely and attached herself to Daisuke's side, insisting she would be perfectly fine given her abilities and declaring that since he was going, they should go together. Rena watched the dynamic with a quiet smile and pointed out that going alone would be dangerous for anyone and suggested they all travel together. Michelle agreed in a way that made it sound like she was doing Rena a favor. Ashley seethed quietly at Michelle's attitude, but said nothing more. They made their way to the entrance of the Axane Cave before long. Rena stood before it and felt the weight of it. This was the place Oliver had come to, and she still did not fully understand why. As soon as they stepped into the darkness inside, Daisuke switched on his flashlight and lit up the cave around them. Michelle was immediately drawn to it, asking what it was with genuine fascination. Daisuke told her it was a flashlight, and a good one at that. Rena asked whether it was some kind of magical item. He explained it was electrical rather than magical, which only deepened Michelle's interest in him as a person. As they walked further in, Daisuke observed aloud that despite being described as a cave, the structure around them felt distinctly constructed rather than natural. Michelle confirmed this, explaining that the passageways had been built by an ancient magical civilization and were likely more significant than they appeared. The fact that all the mechanisms within it were apparently still functioning was a notable detail that pointed to the structure's importance. Ashley perked up at the mention of an untouched place from an ancient civilization, reasoning happily that it probably meant there were valuable items lying around unclaimed. Michelle confirmed the possibility, and Ashley announced she intended to help herself to whatever she found. Rena called the group's attention to something on the wall, letters carved into the stone. Ashley studied them and confirmed they were ancient writing, but admitted she could not read them. Michelle looked more carefully and translated the inscription aloud. It was a challenge, a declaration that those who sought power should present themselves to face the trials, and that those who succeeded would receive what they were searching for. Ashley summarized it with considerably less ceremony, noting it was essentially an invitation to try their luck at the treasure. Daisuke expressed genuine interest in what these trials might involve, noting that in the kinds of stories he was familiar with, this type of setup usually meant immediate and significant trouble. Rena urged the group to stay alert and keep moving. Michelle added a firm warning for everyone to be careful not to touch, step on, or push anything inside the cave. The warning came not a moment too soon. On their very next step, a deep rumbling sound rolled through the stone around them, and everyone froze. Daisuke broke into a nervous sweat. Michelle observed that the sound had been rather ominous. Daisuke confirmed he had heard it too. When Rena turned to Ashley, she found her already sweating, admitting with a wince that she thought she might have stepped on something she should not have. The ground began to shake and a loud sound filled the cave. Michelle identified it as some kind of mechanism being activated. Daisuke warned everyone to be ready for anything. Rena called out to Daisuke to stay close to Michelle. Ashley dissolved into a stream of apologies, blaming herself for not watching her feet. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still and quiet. Michelle blinked in confusion. Daisuke waited cautiously. Rena let out a slow breath of relief, grateful that nothing seemed to have come of it. Ashley complained about being frightened for nothing. Then, without any warning, the floor beneath all of them dropped away. They screamed as they fell, but instead of plummeting straight down, they were channeled into a tube-like passage and sent sliding through it at speed. As they slid, the group was split apart by the branching paths of the tunnel. Daisuke ended up with Michelle, while Rena went with Ashley. Both pairs crashed down hard at the ends of their respective passages and landed in separate chambers. Daisuke came down with a grunt and rubbed his head, and then immediately looked around and registered that Rena and Ashley were nowhere to be seen. The alarm in his voice was clear as he called out for them. In the other chamber, Rena's voice echoed as she called out for Daisuke and Michelle. Ashley, picking herself up, expressed her frustration at being caught in a trap. Michelle assessed the situation and concluded they had been divided into two groups. Daisuke looked up at the opening above them and recognized that going back the way they came was not an option. Michelle agreed and suggested they move forward, reasoning that the other pair would do exactly the same and that they would find each other again further in. Daisuke agreed and noted he was confident Rena and Ashley would reach the same conclusion. As they started moving, Michelle reflected aloud on the remarkable scale of what existed beneath the ground here. Daisuke compared the underground network to a famously large and complex train station from his own world, a reference that meant nothing to Michelle but conveyed the sense of it well enough. Michelle walked close behind him, holding the back of his shirt as they moved through the unfamiliar space. Daisuke noticed more inscriptions on one section of the wall, and both of them stopped to examine the symbols. He reacted with immediate excitement when he recognized the image of a dragon carved into the stone, delighted that his assumption about creatures like that existing in this world had been confirmed. He reached for his phone to take photographs of it. Michelle studied the written inscription beside the image more carefully and began to translate it quietly to herself. The text described a great dragon of apocalyptic power that would rise from deep within the earth. A hero and companions would stand against it, but the dragon's overwhelming strength would ultimately bring them to ruin. Only then, at the moment of their defeat, would the weapons of the gods descend and strike the dragon down. Michelle paused on the phrase weapons of the gods, something about it catching her mind, though she could not yet place why. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daisuke called out for her urgently, telling her to come and look at something nearby. She moved toward him, and what they both saw made them shout in alarm at the same moment. A collection of bones in the chamber had begun to move on their own. The skeletons launched themselves forward without pause. In the other chamber, Ashley's scream rang out as she pressed herself behind Rena, pointing at the large number of skeletal figures closing in on them. Rena identified them immediately. Ashley admitted that this particular type of enemy genuinely frightened her. These were skeletons, the animated remains of adventurers who had died within the dungeon, reanimated by the magical energy that permeated the place. One of them lunged directly at Ashley, sending her scrambling backward in a panic, screaming at it to stop and begging it not to come any closer. Rena's blade came through the air in a clean arc and cut the skeleton down before it could reach her. She moved forward without slowing, taking out the nearby enemies in rapid succession. The bones of the defeated skeletons shattered and flew outward, making Ashley flinch and shriek again. Rena set her feet and raised her sword toward what remained, making it unmistakably clear to everything in the room that she was the one they would have to go through. More skeletons pressed in from every direction. Rena called upon her sword and the strength it could grant her, then threw herself at the enemies without hesitation. She met the blade of the nearest skeleton with a sharp clash of steel, holding the attack back. The skeleton let out an unnerving laugh. Rena's expression was nothing but fierce focus. She exploded into motion, tightening her grip and driving her sword through the skeleton with a single powerful slash, splitting it apart. Ashley, covering behind her, pointed out in horrified amazement that bones were flying everywhere. Rena turned her blade toward what remained of the group and dared whatever was left to come at her. The skeletons paused for a fraction of a moment and then charged all at once. Rena met 3 of them simultaneously without flinching, deflecting their combined attack and cutting through them in quick succession, finishing the last one with a blow sharp enough to shatter it completely. Ashley watched with her mouth open, unable to believe what she was seeing, and asked Lena whether she felt no fear fighting against literal bones and skeletal remains. Lena's response was simple and absolute. It did not matter who the opponent was. If something raised a weapon against her or her companions, she would cut it down. She kept moving as she said it, working through the enemies around her without slowing. Ashley stared at the sheer number of them still remaining, and the reality of where they were settled over her more heavily. She thought aloud that these skeletons had all once been adventurers who had died in this place, which meant the dungeon was significantly more dangerous than even its reputation had suggested. Lena's shout cut through her thoughts, a warning to dodge. Ashley dropped immediately, and Lena's blade swung through the space above her in a turning slash, cutting through the enemies surrounding them in a wide arc. The skeletons that were cut in half wobbled, and then began pulling themselves back upright. Ashley pointed at them in dismay, recognizing that there was no permanent end to them this way. Lena reached the same conclusion and told Ashley they needed to run while they had the chance. Ashley bolted after her, screaming at her not to leave her behind. On the other side of the dungeon, Daisuke was firing repeatedly at the skeletons advancing on him and Michelle, shouting in frustration that he could not tell whether his bullets were actually hitting the targets or passing straight through them. Michelle told him to stay calm. She explained that undead monsters like these were weak against holy attribute magic and began casting immediately. Light gathered around her as she spoke a chant, calling on holy light to drive away the beings of darkness. She released the spell, Holy Wind, and a brilliant light swept through the skeletons, shattering them where they stood until only scattered fragments remained. She declared it a success. Daisuke stared at the result with open amazement. Michelle acknowledged that the effort had used up her magic and she would need time before she could do it again. Daisuke thanked her and steadied himself, looking at the remaining frozen enemies with a clearer head. He reflected on the situation. As physical as these creatures appeared, they were not truly indestructible. They had once been people, just like him, and that reframing took away some of the weight of facing them. He raised the larger weapon he was carrying, the grenade launcher, and Michelle immediately recognized it as the same weapon that had brought down the Kraken. She pointed out with alarm that firing it underground would bring the ceiling down on them and seal them in permanently. Daisuke assured her it was fine because the type of ammunition could be swapped out to suit different situations. He loaded it for this particular use and fired. Flare rounds detonated through the room, flooding it with intense bright light. Michelle shielded her eyes. Daisuke pointed out immediately that having light meant they could now identify and target the skeletons clearly, and he fired at the nearest one, shattering it. He switched to rubber bullets and explained their utility. Weaker penetration compared to standard rounds, but reliable enough to hit even small targets consistently. A skeleton crept up behind Michelle and lunged at her with a chilling sound. Daisuke swung around and fired before it could reach her, and it burst apart on impact. Michelle watched with wide eyes. Daisuke looked at the shattered skeleton on the floor and then watched as it slowly began reassembling itself. The others were doing the same, bones shifting and clicking back into position. Michelle confirmed that shattering them only bought time. If they stayed, the skeletons would fully reform. She told him now was their moment to move. They ran before the creatures could pull themselves back together, sprinting until the sounds behind them faded and they were far enough away to catch their breath. In a quiet that followed, Michelle broke a silence that had become slightly heavier than before. She told Daisuke that he was probably thinking she had been dishonest with everyone. Daisuke looked at her with genuine confusion. She continued, explaining what she had not said in front of the others, that while she genuinely could use every type of magic as she claimed, her constitution meant that the amount of magical energy her body could hold at any one time was very small. She could use powerful magic, but only in limited amounts before it was gone. She said it with eyes full of conflicting feelings. Daisuke's response surprised her. He told her he did not think she had lied at all. Her magic was genuinely extraordinary, and he was certain she was exactly what she said she was, a prodigy. He then added something personal, mentioning that when he had been around her age, there had been very few people who shared his own particular interest in airsoft guns. He told her to have confidence in herself and in what she could do. Michelle smiled, and then the smile broke into something much bigger, and she threw herself at him, declaring she had known he was a good person. Daisuke laughed and said he was glad she had found her spirit again. After a moment, he noticed the space around them had changed. The chamber they had come into was noticeably brighter and considerably more open than anywhere they had been. Then Lena's voice rang out from somewhere nearby. Daisuke spun toward the sound. Lena and Ashley were peering through a small opening in the wall on the other side of the room, having found their way to the adjacent chamber. Daisuke called out to Ashley as well, visibly relieved to see both of them were all right. Ashley responded with an embarrassed admission that they had managed somehow. The four of them looked around at the space with bewildered expressions, unable to quite identify what kind of room they were in. Ashley's relief quickly turned to frustration when she realized the opening between them was too small for anyone to pass through. Daisuke agreed it was not going to work. Michelle moved closer to a section of the wall and found a carved symbol there, which she translated aloud. The inscription described a trial of two minds. Those who wish to pass through the door would need to combine their wisdom and unite their will. Lena noted that since it was called a trial, it made sense that they were currently being tested in some way. Ashley moved toward what appeared to be the door in question, touched it thoughtfully, and then gave it a slight push. It swung open with ease. The moment the door opened, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was an enormous armored knight, kneeling silently on one knee. A voice spoke into the space, announcing that the trial would begin from the moment the door was opened. On both sides of the door, all four of them went rigid. The massive armored figure began to rise and move. Lena stared at the armor on the other side of the doorway in shock. Daisuke reacted with equal alarm, struggling to accept that this was what the trial actually consisted of. The enormous armored figure moved into the chamber with slow and deliberate steps, each one sending a deep echo through the stone floor. Daisuke stared at it and turned the words of the inscription over in his mind. Two minds trial. Ashley wondered aloud whether the challenge simply meant they had to defeat the thing in front of them. The ghost armor, a suit of armor that had taken on a life of its own and become a creature capable of independent movement, crossed fully into the room and immediately raised its sword without any warning. Ashley barely threw herself out of the way as the blade came crashing down, and where she had been standing the stone floor cracked and shattered from the force of the impact. She scrambled away in a panic, declaring that defeating something like this was beyond them and that they should make for the exit. She ran for the door, but found it had sealed itself shut the moment the trial had begun. There was no way out that way. Lena was already moving. She charged the ghost armor with a shout, leaping into the air and bringing her sword down at it with full force. The armor raised its shield, and the blow was stopped cold. Lena crashed back to the floor hard. She pushed herself up and noted the defense was extraordinary. Ashley peered through the small opening between the chambers and called to Daisuke on the other side, asking whether he could use one of his more powerful weapons to deal with the armor. Daisuke told her he had them available, but that using anything with that kind of explosive force underground would bring the structure down on top of all of them, and none of them would survive that. He turned the question over in his mind, trying to identify which of his weapons would actually be useful here. Lena planted herself in front of the ghost armor and studied it with sharp and focused eyes. Something struck her as unusual. Without an exposed core to defend, the armor was using its shield to protect itself. It was guarding something deliberately. Her eyes moved across the armor's body until she found it. A crystal embedded in the armor structure. The moment she recognized it for what it was, she moved. She drove forward and drove her blade into the crystal at the armor's knee, shattering it. The ghost armor staggered and went down on one knee with a crash that shook the floor. Ashley stared in disbelief, barely able to process what she had just seen. Lena called across to Daisuke immediately, telling him the crystals were the weak points and instructing him to aim his weapon at them. Daisuke confirmed what she was saying and reached through a small portal to retrieve a new weapon. Michelle reacted with wide-eyed surprise at its appearance. Daisuke explained it quickly. It was a CQBR, an M4 carbine with a modified barrel used primarily by special forces. It was a close-quarter battle assault rifle built specifically for use in enclosed spaces, such as the interior of buildings or ships, which made it appropriate for the situation they were in. He reloaded, aimed at the crystal embedded in the armor on his side of the door, and fired. The crystal shattered cleanly. Michelle and Ashley both reacted with excitement at the result. Then Daisuke's voice shifted. He had noticed something wrong. The crystals were regenerating, growing back together before their eyes. Lena confirmed the same thing was happening on her side. She demanded to know why. Daisuke continued firing at the enemy to keep it occupied while he tried to think. Lena was dodging the ghost armor's attacks at the same time, and Daisuke narrowly avoided the sweeping blade on his side as well, pulling back from it as it came down. Michelle had gone quiet, her mind working. She repeated the inscription to herself in a low murmur, put together both their wisdom and combined their will as one. She turned the phrase over once more, and then it came to her. She called out to everyone with urgency. The trial was not asking each side to attack their own armor separately. Two minds meant both groups had to strike the same crystal on the same armor at exactly the same moment. That was what combining their will as one actually required. Lena understood immediately and called back her confirmation to Daisuke, telling him to be ready. Daisuke said he would follow Lena's lead on which target to strike first, since he could attack from a distance and match her timing for where he was standing. Lena took a breath, fixed her eyes on the armor in front of her, and called out the first target, the left arm. Lena moved with explosive speed, using the ghost armor's own shield as a stepping stone to launch herself into the air. She came down with her sword pointed directly at the crystal and drove it through, shattering it completely. Ashley called the signal to Daisuke from the other side. Daisuke raised his weapon, took steady aim, and fired. The shot slammed into the ghost armor on his side, and the crystal there shattered as well. The moment both crystals were destroyed simultaneously, the arm of the armor visibly changed in appearance, and Michelle pointed it out immediately. The color had shifted, and this time the damage was not reversing itself. The crystals were not regenerating. Ashley urged Lena to press the advantage without letting up. Lena threw herself back at the enemy and called the next target, the right leg. She hit the crystal there with a clean strike and shattered it. The ghost armor buckled and collapsed to the floor with a heavy crash. Rena coordinated with Daisuke again immediately, and he fired into the same position on his side. The two of them fell into a focused rhythm, working in precise coordination. Rena would strike a crystal on her armor, and a fraction of a second later Daisuke's shot would hit the matching location on the armor facing him. Each strike followed by its counterpart in rapid succession. Crystal after crystal shattered under the combined assault from both sides. The ghost armor that had been terrorizing Rena and Ashley's side of the chamber finally went still and crumpled to the floor, no longer moving. Rena stood over it, catching her breath, and confirmed it had stopped. Michelle reported the same from Daisuke's side. Daisuke asked whether that meant it was finished. Michelle's attention shifted, and she pointed urgently to the chest of the armor, a panel there was opening. She identified what was inside as the final core and told Daisuke to destroy it. Before anyone could act, the orb inside pulsed with an intense light and discharged a laser without any warning. It tore through everything it touched, cracking and shattering the walls around it. Both Daisuke and Michelle threw themselves out of the beam's path just in time. On the other side, Rena dove clear as a laser tore through that chamber as well. Ashley stared at the destruction, left behind in disbelief. Rena had no explanation for what it was, but recognized immediately that this core was not going to be dealt with as easily as the crystals had been. The orb fired again, and the walls cracked further. Michelle leapt away from the impact. Daisuke recognized that at this rate the ceiling would not hold. Structural damage was accumulating too quickly, and it would come down on all of them. He told Michelle to get as far back as she could, while he drew the orb's attention toward himself. He called across to Rena at the same moment. She asked if he was all right, and told him she would end it. Without hesitation, she charged the orb on her side, raised her sword high, and brought it down through the center of the orb, splitting it cleanly in two. She threw herself back as the ghost armor's body began to break apart and collapse around her. On the other side, Michelle called out for Daisuke with sharp alarm, her eyes going wide. Daisuke had his weapon up and trained on the orb in front of him. He pulled the trigger without pause, and the orb shattered completely. Ashley erupted with relief and joy. At that moment, the wall dividing the two groups simply vanished. Michelle pointed it out as it disappeared. Rena greeted both of them with a wide and genuine smile, expressing her relief that they were unharmed. Daisuke smiled back and confirmed that they had come through without any real trouble. The four of them stood together in a quiet moment of shared relief, the tension of the fight giving way to something lighter. Then Rena noticed something. An entrance had appeared in the wall where there had been none before. Michelle read the inscription above it, which stated that those who had completed the trials were now permitted to proceed. Rena stood looking at it and felt a knot of anticipation tighten in her chest, wondering quietly whether Oliver had stood in this exact spot and passed through this same threshold. Daisuke noticed the look on her face and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, telling her not to worry and expressing his confidence that there would be something useful waiting for them inside. The encouragement reached her and her expression cleared. She nodded, and the group stepped through the entrance together. Michelle's voice drew everyone's attention almost immediately once they were inside. The walls of the new chamber were covered in elaborate murals, and she was clearly struck by them. Rena agreed they were remarkable. Michelle studied them and wondered aloud whether the images depicted the creatures that lived within the dungeon. Ashley, looking at Michelle, brought up the question she had been sitting on since the island. Michelle had said at the start that this dungeon was hers to conquer, and Ashley wanted to know what exactly she was there to find. Michelle explained that she had come across references to it in old records left behind by adventurers who had explored the dungeon long ago. Somewhere deep within lay a piece of legendary equipment that she had been searching for. She believed that obtaining it would transform her from someone who claimed to be a genius mage into someone who truly was one in every sense of the word. Deep below them, further down into the dungeon than any of them had yet gone, the thing she was searching for sat waiting in the dark. A massive mural of a multi-headed snake stretched across the wall, and beneath it lay piles of treasure scattered across the floor. In the shadows, real snakes waited silently, coiled and patient, watching for prey. Meanwhile, Koga and the others pressed deeper into the dungeon, pushing further into the darkness. Rena wondered aloud whether someone named Oliver had really made it past this point before them. Koga said he had no way of knowing anything about this Oliver, and that there was no telling whether anyone had passed through here at all. Rena and Michelle both flinched slightly at his words. Then Michelle spotted something and called out to the others. As they entered the chamber, they looked around in stunned silence. Rena noted that the number of passageways leading into the space was remarkable and suspected that all the other tunnels from different directions converged right here at this point. Koga observed that this place must be the final destination of all those paths, though he was puzzled by its nature. Ashley called out from across the chamber, drawing everyone's attention. They followed her up a staircase and through an entrance into the next space. The moment they stepped inside, their mouths fell open. Piles of treasure were scattered everywhere across the floor. Swords, gold, artifacts, and equipment of every kind. Michelle explained that this was the innermost sanctum of Axane Cave, and that according to ancient records, it had once served as a vault for magical items. Rena reacted with shock, barely able to believe that every single item in the room was magical. Ashley was immediately excited, declaring that if they sold everything, they would become extraordinarily wealthy overnight. Koga muttered to himself that with magic involved, there was a chance he might be able to make use of some of it as well. Michelle pointed out that the weapons were the most impressive items in the collection. She reached out, grasped a sword, and raised it high. The blade burst into a brilliant radiant glow. She explained that each and every weapon had its own distinct attribute and effect, and that even a small amount of magic power was enough to activate them. Ashley immediately wanted to try one for herself, and Lena's eyes landed on a necklace that drew her incompletely. She gazed at it in quiet admiration. Then, without warning, the necklace transformed into a shield right before her eyes. She murmured to herself in amazement, identifying it as an accessory capable of becoming a shield, a jewel shield, and remarking on how surprisingly light it was. Michelle's attention was pulled away by a sudden shout of strange words. She turned to find Koga standing in an unusual stance, gripping his staff tightly and shouting what he claimed was a magic incantation he remembered from elementary school. Michelle told him flatly that no such incantation existed in magic. Koga ignored her and continued shouting other strange phrases in quick succession. Michelle observed with calm certainty that he appeared to have no magical ability whatsoever. Koga sank to the floor in visible disappointment, muttering that it was a shame. Ashley drew everyone's attention again with a shout. She cracked a whip sharply against an orb across the room, and the orb immediately flew through the air and landed in her hand. She giggled with delight, feeling fairly certain she had a natural talent with this particular weapon. Michelle identified it as an attractive whip, one that would stick to whatever object the user directed it at. Ashley then turned the question back to Michelle, asking whether she had found what she had been looking for. Michelle dug through the pile of treasures as she answered, explaining that the item she sought was a specific type of magical equipment described in ancient records, not an ordinary magic item powered by magic energy like the ones they had been playing with. Ashley, a little stung, asked whether the item would be so special that she herself would not even be able to use it. Michelle did not respond to that. Lena quickly intervened and said Ashley's name in a tone that carried a quiet reminder. Ashley fell silent, and a flicker of guilt crossed her face as she recognized that her comment had landed harshly. Both Lena and Koga watched as Michelle searched through the pile with genuine focus and determination. Someone suggested they all help, and the group began digging through the treasures together. Then Michelle heard it, a voice, sudden and unexpected, speaking of chosen ones who could benefit from its power and inviting them to seek it out. She looked up in the direction of the voice and was stunned to see a staircase that had not been there when they arrived. She cried out that she had found it. The others turned to her in confusion. She pointed ahead with urgency, shouting that what she was looking for was right there. Lena looked in the direction she was pointing and could only see a solid wall and asked whether Michelle meant something beyond it. Michelle froze. Then she pointed again and insisted that it was right there, demanding to know whether the others could not see it. Ashley asked what she was looking at. Koga suggested there might be some kind of hidden mechanism in the wall. Michelle did not wait for any further discussion. She moved forward and stepped onto the staircase. To everyone else, it looked as though she had simply stepped into the air and was floating. Ashley reacted with shock. Koga confirmed with equal surprise that she appeared to be floating. Lena covered her mouth, deeply unsettled and unable to make sense of it. Ashley called out that Michelle must have discovered something they could not see. The voice returned, this time asking Michelle what she sought as she climbed the invisible stairs. Ashley's eyes went wide at the sound of it, immediately finding it deeply ominous. Koga confirmed he could hear it as well. Michelle answered the voice loudly and clearly, stating that she sought strength that would benefit her. There was no reply. The entire chamber fell into a tense and breathless silence as they all waited. Then the wall slid open, revealing another entrance. The mysterious voice echoed once more, announcing that their next trial awaited them. Michelle barely had time to react to those words when the entire chamber shook violently and a deafening sound filled the air. The three of them cried out in alarm as a massive multi-headed serpent came slithering through the newly opened entrance. Ashley screamed in disbelief at the sight of the creature. Michelle stared at it with her jaw open and identified it immediately. It was a hydra. Someone asked whether that was not the legendary monster from the old stories. The hydra opened its enormous jaws and lunged toward them. Lena cried out to the others that this was no ordinary monster. The creature aimed itself at Koga, but he managed to throw himself out of the way in time, and the hydra's jaws crashed into a pile of treasure instead. Lena called out his name in worry. Ashley reasoned aloud that since Michelle had said there was another trial, they were probably going to have to defeat this thing. Michelle shouted that it was hopeless and urged everyone to run. But Lena told her sharply to go. Just go. Michelle stopped and stared at her, stunned by the directness of it. Lena stood facing the hydra with her sword raised and declared firmly that if they fled, the creature would simply pursue all of them. They were going to stop it right there. Michelle started to protest, but Ashley cut her off. She reminded Michelle that what she was looking for was just beyond that tunnel, and asked whether becoming a true genius mage was not what she had always wanted. Ashley gave her a steady smile. Koga reloaded his weapon and added his voice to theirs, telling Michelle not to worry about them. He stated with complete confidence that they were not going to lose. Michelle stood there for a moment, their words washing over her and rendering her speechless. Then she took one last look at the three of them, turned, and ran toward the passage without looking back. The others dropped into their fighting stances behind her, weapons raised and ready as the hydra bore down on them. As Michelle ran deeper into the tunnel, her thoughts burned with fierce determination. She was going to become a true genius mage. She asked them silently to wait for her, and she made a vow to herself, without words, but with everything she had, she would come back for them. With every movement of the seven-headed demonic beast, the floor trembled beneath them, and a crashing noise echoed through the chamber. The hydra was a legendary monster from ancient records, said to possess 7 heads and extraordinary power. Rena called out to Ashley, and between the two of them, they established their shared objective without needing to say much. They were there to make sure the creature did not get in Michelle's way. They exchanged smiles, and a quiet understanding passed between them, though Rena felt a flicker of private worry about whether Michelle would be all right on her own. Ashley's expression mirrored the same concern, but they both pushed the worry aside, reassuring each other and themselves that Michelle would not fail. With that settled, Rena set her jaw, sprinted toward the hydra, leapt into the air, and drove her blade deep into the creature's scaly body. At the same moment, Ashley snapped her whip forward and latched it onto a sword lying nearby on the ground. The moment the whip made contact with the sword, it burst into light. With careful precision, Ashley flung it through the air toward the hydra. The blade spun in a wide arc and buried itself into one of the creature's heads. The hydra bellowed in pain. Ashley allowed herself a satisfied smirk. But before anyone could celebrate, Rena cried out a warning. One of the hydra's other heads was closing in fast on Ashley's left side. Ashley froze, caught off guard and gripped by sudden panic. The hydra's jaws were nearly upon her when Koga appeared directly in front of her out of nowhere and fired his gun at the monster, forcing it to rear back and halt its advance. Ashley exhaled in pure relief and called his name. Koga checked quickly that she was all right before swiftly reloading and firing again. Ashley watched in amazement at the speed of it. Koga told them about his weapon as he worked. It was a Winchester M73, a lever-action rifle developed during the era of Western Frontier expansion. Its rapid reload capability had made it a dominant weapon of that time, and the Winchester name had become legendary for exactly that reason. He fired again without pausing. Then another hydra head crept up silently behind him. Koga reacted instantly, raising a second gun in his other hand and firing it directly at the approaching head. He made clear that the Winchester was not his only weapon. In one fluid motion, he spun the rifle, chambered a fresh round, took aim, and fired straight at the hydra's head again. He stated with firm resolve that he was going to make absolutely certain nothing got in Michelle's way. Meanwhile, further into the cave, Michelle was still running. She spotted the exit ahead and pushed herself toward it through labored breaths. The moment she stepped through, she came to a sudden stop. A row of armor and weapons stood before her in an organized display, and her eyes went wide. She recognized immediately that this was the place, the storage room for equipment crafted using the highest level of ancient technology. She scanned the display and noticed that a few stands were empty, meaning some pieces had already been taken. Then her gaze landed on what she had been searching for. She gasped in pure amazement. It matched exactly what the ancient book had described, the magical equipment created by the Grand Mage Domar himself. She took hold of it and called out to the others, telling them to wait just a little longer and that she would return to them soon. But at that moment, an invisible force seized her wrist. She cried out in shock, completely unable to understand what was happening. Then a voice spoke. It identified itself as Domar, explaining that it had placed its soul inside the piece of equipment while waiting for a suitable physical body to come along. A presence began to emerge from within the armor. Michelle stared in stunned disbelief, barely able to process that she was being addressed by Domar himself. The presence told her it had observed the trial she had gone through, and that she had tried to use her power to save her friends. Michelle suddenly screamed. Her magical power was being drained away without her consent. The voice told her to offer her physical body to it. It reassured her that even if she lost all of her magic power, and even her consciousness, she would not die. Michelle refused immediately, comparing the situation to being turned into a puppet. The soul's presence pinned her down with force and declared with absolute certainty that she should consider it an honor. She was, it insisted, the greatest mage ever to have existed, and she would be reborn as Domar. Back in the main chamber, the battle against the hydra raged without pause. One of the creature's heads came hurtling toward Rena, and she activated her jewel shield just in time, holding it steady as the force of the blow slammed against it. Koga fired his rifle at the hydra to stop it from pressing any closer. Ashley cried out that Koga's attacks were working and urged Rena to deliver a finishing blow. With a fierce shout, Rena lunged forward and unleashed a powerful sword technique she called Wave Slasher, bringing her blade down in a clean and precise arc that severed one of the hydra's heads completely. Blood splattered across the creature's body, and the remaining heads let out a tremendous roar of pain. Ashley cried out that they had done it. One head was down. Rena staggered from the effort, panting hard, and declared that 6 more remained. Koga moved quickly to catch her as she stumbled, telling her steadily that there was no need to rush herself. Then Ashley stopped. Her expression shifted to one of alarm. The severed head of the hydra was bubbling with blood, and then, before their eyes, a new head began to grow in its place. Ashley's jaw dropped. Koga stared in disbelief. Ashley could barely contain her outrage, pointing out furiously that the head had simply grown back and that the other wounds on the creature's body were already starting to close as well. She demanded to know how they were supposed to defeat something like this. Koga fired another shot at one of the heads and immediately assessed the situation aloud. The Winchester could stop one head at a time, but it was not nearly enough to defeat all of them. He thought through alternatives quickly and dismissed each one. Even a more powerful anti-material rifle would be useless if the regeneration kept pace with the damage. What he needed was a weapon powerful enough to attack continuously without giving the Hydra any window of time to regenerate. Something that would not stop. Then it hit him. He snapped to attention and immediately opened a small portal. He announced that he had purchased something back in Akihabara using his winter bonus from the previous year and had stored it somewhere in the back corner of his closet. He reached through the portal with both hands and began pulling something through, a large and heavy piece of metal that he set firmly on the ground and began assembling methodically. He extended the stand and adjusted the length with practiced efficiency. Rena called out to him in confusion, uncertain of what he was doing. Ashley watched and told herself and Rena that Koga clearly had a plan and that they needed to trust it. Rena immediately understood what that meant. They needed to keep the Hydra occupied and buy him whatever time he needed. Koga reached back through the portal and pulled out a large and unmistakably heavy gun, setting it into position with the same steady focus. A loud crashing sound continued to echo through the chamber as the Hydra pressed its assault without letting up. One of its heads lunged directly at Rena. She moved quickly, ducking beneath the strike, and drove her sword downward as she went, dragging the blade along the full length of the creature's neck. Ashley snapped her whip at a Hydra head that was closing in on her side, landing the hit but grimacing as she did. She muttered to herself that she had no other choice and had to fall back on an ability from before. But her words cut off suddenly as her foot came down on something unexpected on the ground. Rena, meanwhile, was still locked in fierce combat with the monster. She leapt into the air and spun with remarkable speed, and as she came down toward the Hydra, she drove her sword deep into its body and tore through it in a powerful slashing motion, severing another one of the creature's heads. The strange artifact Ashley had stepped on began to glow without warning. Ashley looked at it in bewilderment, unable to understand why it had suddenly lit up. The glow intensified rapidly, and Ashley barely had time to react before she found herself transformed into a mouse. She let out a stunned sound of pure disbelief. Rena and Koga both turned and froze, staring at where Ashley had just been standing, both of them crying out in shock at the same moment. In the other room, Lidomar had Michelle pinned to the floor and was laughing with cold amusement, telling her to stop resisting. The presence explained how mana worked. It floated freely in the surrounding environment, and people drew upon it according to how much their body could store and convert. A magician's ability was ultimately determined by their equipment and their mana conversion rate. As for the equipment Michelle had found, it was designed to expand the user's capacity by drawing out their magical power and storing it. However, Lidomar explained, an ordinary person would simply lose consciousness the moment their magic power was taken, making resistance impossible. It told Michelle her resistance was futile and demanded she surrender her body. Lidomar's soul pressed down harder on her. Then something gave the presence pause. It noted with genuine confusion that there was something strange about Michelle. Even after having so much of her magic power drain away, she had not lost consciousness. It demanded to know what she truly was. Michelle's lips slowly curled into a small and knowing smile. She began to rise. She observed calmly that Lidomar had left a reserve of magic power inside the equipment, just enough to sustain itself, which meant the equipment had not been entirely empty. Lidomar cried out that it was impossible, that Michelle should not be able to move at all. Michelle met the presence with a steady and sharp gaze. She explained who she truly was. Since birth, she had only been able to gather small amounts of magic power, and her mana conversion rate was the worst imaginable. By all conventional measures, she should have been the weakest kind of mage. But then, with a sudden surge of strength, she pushed back against Lidomar and declared her special constitution. She possessed the rare ability to draw upon the mana that existed freely in the surrounding environment and channel it directly into herself. Because the mana around her was essentially limitless and impossible to eliminate entirely, her body could never truly run out of magical power, regardless of how poor her conversion rate was. Lidomar reacted with stunned shock. Michelle pressed the advantage, asking with quiet confidence why the presence had gone so quiet all of a sudden. Lidomar, for its part, was in a state of internal panic, realizing it had drawn too much power from Michelle and had been pushed into a desperate corner. It concluded that it had no choice but to eliminate her immediately. Michelle felt the shift in the air behind her a split second before the attack came. She spun around instantly and called out a spell. A glowing barrier of light appeared just in time and blocked the incoming strike completely. Michelle stared at what she had just done with wide and amazed eyes. She could not use that spell before, and yet it had come out effortlessly just now. She felt as though any spell she could imagine was suddenly within her reach. Without another moment of hesitation, she removed the robe and clothing that had belonged to the equipment and held the mage's hat that came with it in her hands. She declared quietly but firmly that it was hers now. Lai Domar's soul raged at having been defeated by a young girl. Michelle simply smirked and pointed out the reason. She was a genius, and she had surpassed even Lai Domar. Back in the main chamber, Koga was still working on setting up his weapon. As he adjusted his equipment, he caught sight of Rena running at full speed with the hydra bearing down on her from close behind. Rena cried out that there was no end to the creatures' heads and that they could not keep this up. Ashley, still in her mouse form, urged Rena to run faster. Rena shouted back that it was physically impossible. Koga called out to Rena by name and aimed his weapon. Rena responded immediately, telling him they were managing and urging him to keep working on whatever he was doing. The hydra struck at her, and she dodged, letting out a sharp cry. Another attack came, and she avoided it again, but then her foot caught on something on the ground. Ashley squeaked in panic, fearing they were about to become the creature's meal. Then a voice rang out, and in the same instant a blazing fireball came streaking through the chamber and struck one of the hydra's heads directly, exploding on impact and stopping the creature just as it was about to reach Rena. Rena and Ashley both froze with their mouths open in disbelief. Koga stood equally stunned. Before the hydra could even process what had just hit it, another volley of fireballs came flying through the air. The explosions rocked the monster from multiple directions, and it roared in pain and confusion. Rena squeezed her eyes shut against the force of the blasts. Then another spell came, a command for countless bolts of lightning to manifest from the atmosphere and strike the enemy. Lightning cracked down onto the hydra's heads one after another, and the creature groaned in agony. When the attack finally subsided, the hydra's body stood smoldering, motionless, and charred. Michelle descended gently to the ground. She apologized for making everyone wait and greeted them with a warm smile, announcing herself as their genius mage. Rena and Ashley both cried her name in relief and joy. Koga called out to her as well. Rena asked immediately whether she had found what she was looking for. Michelle answered simply that she had, and then turned to the three of them and thanked them with genuine emotion, her cheeks flushing red as she did. Then Rena cried out a warning. The hydra was beginning to regenerate. Michelle spun her staff rapidly above her head and leveled her weapon at the approaching creature. She told the others calmly, but with complete confidence, that from this point on, they could leave everything to her. She added that this trial had been hers in the first place, so it was right that she be the one to finish it. Now that she had become a true genius mage, she announced she was going to show all of them exactly what that meant against the hydra. Michelle held her ground and stared down the hydra with sharp and unwavering eyes. She touched the brim of the hat on her head and acknowledged what the Lai Domar equipment had given her, the ability to gather magical power far beyond what she could before. She began to assess the creature's nature quietly to herself, noting that a hydra's defining characteristics were its ability to attack continuously using all 7 of its heads and its extraordinary regenerative capability. But before she could finish the thought, the hydra let out a thunderous roar and surged forward, its heads weaving and snapping as it charged straight at her. Ashley called out a warning, reminding Michelle of just how fast the hydra could regenerate. Then Ashley stopped herself mid-sentence in a moment of pure bewilderment. She had just spoken, which meant the mouse had spoken. She screamed at the realization, completely thrown by her own voice coming from the tiny body she was now inhabiting. She quickly clarified that it was her, Ashley, and explained in distress that a cursed item had done this to her. Michelle looked at Ashley with a flash of delighted curiosity. Then, without any warning, she picked Ashley up and tossed her through the air, telling her she was a little busy right now and would deal with the curse later. Rena caught Ashley in her hands before she could fall. Ashley protested indignantly at being thrown around without warning. Michelle turned her full attention back to the hydra towering before her. She told the others to keep their distance so they would not get caught up in her magic. Her plan was to flood the creature with her magical attacks until its regenerative ability became overwhelmed and gave out. Light began to swirl around her, gathering and building, the hat on her head glowing brightly as she collected power. She raised her hand and called out a spell, commanding water to freeze and form into arrows to pierce through the enemy. She unleashed a storm of ice. Shards of ice came raining down in a torrent, and the arrows struck the hydra hard from multiple directions. The monster screamed in pain, its heads twisting and writhing in fury. Koga stared with wide eyes at the display. Then one of the hydra's heads suddenly turned toward him, jaws wide open, and lunged. Before it could reach him, a cascade of ice arrows came crashing down and pinned the creature's head firmly to the ground. Michelle immediately called out to check whether he was all right. Koga told her she had just saved him. Michelle declared firmly that she would not allow her friends to be harmed. She moved straight into her next spell, commanding the wind to form into infinite blades and cut through everything before her. She unleashed a wind slash, and countless blades of wind appeared and tore across the hydra's heads in rapid succession. The creature writhed and roared in agony. Rena watched with open amazement, finally seeing what Michelle's true power looked like when fully unleashed. But within seconds, the hydra's wounds sealed themselves shut and disappeared entirely, as though the damage had never happened. Michelle took a quick step back, thinking aloud. The regeneration rate was undeniably extraordinary. But then something else caught her attention. The pattern of the creature's regeneration seemed to be growing slower compared to before. The realization hit her immediately. The Hydra was counting its remaining magical power. If she did not finish it quickly, she was going to exhaust her own magic reserves before it ran out. She moved without hesitation into another spell, casting an acceleration on her own body to move with the speed of wind. She announced she was going in at close range. She sprinted forward with blinding speed, slid onto the back of one of the Hydra's massive bodies, and ran along its length. From point-blank range, she raised her hand and called out another spell, commanding the flames of hell to unleash hellfire and burn the creature from within. She cried out the name of the spell, and a blazing inferno erupted across the monster's body. Rena shielded her eyes from the blast. Ashley cried out in amazement. Rena agreed that it was extraordinary, though she could not help worrying aloud about whether Michelle herself was going to be all right in the middle of all of it. Michelle swore under her breath. Something was wrong. Even after taking that amount of damage, the regeneration was not falling behind the way she had expected it to. She muttered to herself in frustration, trying to understand it. The creature should not have been able to keep up at this rate. But instead of simply healing, it seemed almost as though the Hydra was hardening itself in the moments immediately following each attack. Before she could work out what that meant, a brilliant light suddenly surrounded the Hydra, and it let out a tremendous roar. Something was changing. Ashley noticed Rena had gone still and asked what was wrong. Rena started to answer, but could not finish the words. The Hydra's form was shifting, visibly, dramatically changing. Michelle stood frozen, staring at it in open shock. The Hydra had completely transformed into something different. She cried out in disbelief that the creature was evolving. Then a voice reached into her mind without warning. It called her foolish. Michelle recognized it instantly. It was Domar. The voice told her that the creature had the ability to counter the very magic she was using against it. Michelle stopped cold. She could barely process what she had just heard. Domar elaborated, explaining that a Hydra's power was not limited to regeneration alone. Its true ability was adaptation, the capacity to evolve in response to the attacks it received and develop a resistance to them. That was its real nature, and it was entirely befitting of a monster that had earned its place in legend. The Hydra lunged toward them with sudden and overwhelming force. Domar's voice reached into Michelle's mind once more, telling her that despite the creature having 7 heads, only one of them was its true body, and that failing to concentrate her attacks on that true body was what had been leading her toward defeat. Michelle reacted immediately and unleashed a volley of fireballs at the monster. The Hydra did not even flinch. Domar's voice returned, telling her it was futile. Weak magic of that kind would no longer have any effect against the creature now that it had adapted. Michelle insisted back that there were still spells she had not yet used. But then the reality of her situation hit her all at once. She had run out of magical power entirely. The Hydra was closing in fast. As the creature's enormous jaws came sweeping down toward her, Michelle forced out one final desperate spell. A barrier of crackling electrical energy flared to life around her, halting the Hydra's advance just in time. She strained against the immense pressure the monster was exerting on the barrier, her whole body trembling with the effort of holding it. Rena came sprinting toward her without hesitation, calling her name. Michelle screamed as the barrier finally shattered under the force. The Hydra lunged, and a deafening crash filled the chamber. In that moment of extremity, a memory came to her unbidden. She was younger, standing before a gentle woman who turned to her with a calm and patient expression and asked what was wrong. Michelle had been on the verge of tears, her voice cracking as she tried to speak. She told the woman, her older sister, that she was useless. She explained that she could not become a proper mage the way her sister was, that she had been born with a constitution that made it nearly impossible to gather magical power in the usual way. It was the same as having no talent for magic at all, she had said. Her sister had been quiet for a moment before responding. She acknowledged that Michelle's condition, the magic disease she had contracted, meant her time was limited. But she told Michelle with quiet certainty that she still had a future, and that she alone could decide what she wanted to be and what she would become. She told Michelle that words, like magic, carried absolute power, that when one declared something with enough conviction, it could become reality. Michelle whispered her sister's name. Her sister then told her simply to say it proudly, to call herself a genius and mean it. She had opened her arms wide and invited Michelle into her embrace, holding her younger sister close and speaking a quiet prayer to whatever power might be listening, asking that this child be protected until the day she could walk through the world with her head held high. Those words echoed in Michelle's mind as she lay face down on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. She lifted her eyes slowly and confirmed what she already feared. Every last bit of her magical power was gone. She pushed herself up and muttered that it was useless. She gritted her teeth and silently apologized to her sister, certain that this was the end. Then a voice cut through the silence and snapped her back. Ashley's voice rang out sharply, demanding that Michelle get herself together. She reminded Michelle fiercely that she was a genius. At almost the same moment, Lena cried out the name of a technique and thrust her sword into the charging monster, an explosion erupting from the blade on impact and stopping the creature in its tracks. Michelle cried out in surprise at the sight of Lena fighting at that level. Lena expressed relief that Michelle was unhurt, grabbed her by the hand, and pulled her away from the monster without wasting a second. Across the chamber, Koga had almost finished his preparations. He closed the chamber of the weapon after reloading it with ammunition, then pulled a lever on the side with practiced precision. Lena and Michelle ran together as the hydra bore down on them from behind. Lena cried out to Koga in desperation. He answered immediately, shouting for them to get behind him. Michelle's eyes went wide when she saw what he had set up. Koga told him warmly that because everyone had protected him and bought him the time he needed, he had been able to finish everything. He thanked them. He quickly ran through his final checks, confirming the ammunition feed and the safety mechanism were both ready. Ashley's voice came from somewhere behind them, edged with panic, warning him that the hydra was almost on top of them. Koga stood his ground without moving. He raised his voice and called the order to fire. He pulled the trigger. A deafening eruption of sound burst from the weapon as a relentless stream of bullets tore into the hydra. The creature staggered under the assault, letting out a tremendous groan as round after round pierced through its thick scales. Koga held his position with complete steadiness, gripping the weapon and maintaining the hail of fire without letting up. Lena could only watch in stunned silence at the sheer, devastating force of the attack. Michelle stood equally frozen, muttering to herself that she had never seen anything like it in her life and could barely comprehend what she was witnessing. The gun finally went quiet, its barrel trailing smoke from the sustained intensity of the assault. Then, into the silence that followed, Koga spoke directly to Michelle. He told her that she had a future. The words struck her instantly, and in her mind the image of her sister appeared again, her gentle voice echoing the same truth, that Michelle certainly had a future. Michelle stood completely still, the echo of both voices layering over each other. Koga continued, telling her she did not need to push herself beyond her limits, that she simply had to move at her own pace and keep refining the talents that were already hers. He said with absolute conviction that he would never allow anyone or anything to take that future away from her. He resumed firing as he said it, adding that both he and the M2 Browning would make sure of that. Bullets poured toward the hydra like a relentless rainfall. Every time the creature attempted to lunge forward, the continuous stream of fire forced it to stop and pull back. The round struck and pierced through its tough scales repeatedly. Lena cried out in amazement, saying that compared to everything they had used against the creature before, this weapon was on a completely different level. She started to say something more to Koga, but could not find the words. Koga paused the firing and explained what the weapon was. The M2 Browning, a heavy machine gun designed by the legendary weapons engineer Browning. He noted that while it could not be moved due to being fixed to a pedestal, it was capable of firing anti-material 12.7 by a 99 NATO ammunition in a sustained and continuous stream. Ashley stared in disbelief at the idea that the gun could shoot without stopping. But Lena called out a new warning. The hydra had begun healing its wounds. The gashes across its body were closing rapidly. Lena stared at the speed of the regeneration in disbelief and wondered aloud whether the creature had any weakness at all. Michelle called out to Koga with something she had figured out. The hydra had 7 heads, but one of them was its real head. She told him that attacking the other 6 heads was never going to be enough to defeat it for good. Koga started to respond, and then cut himself off, his eyes already moving back to the creature. He looked more carefully, and what he saw confirmed it. While 6 of the hydra's heads showed cracks and damage along their scales, one head at the back remained entirely untouched. Not a single mark on it, its surface completely pristine. Lena pointed it out to the others. Koga acknowledged it immediately. Michelle muttered to herself that the creature had likely been using its other heads as a shield to protect the real one all along. Koga returned to his gun without wasting another moment and called out that he would aim directly at it. He pulled the trigger and unleashed another barrage, this time directing every shot at the central head. But the other heads responded instantly, moving to intercept and block the bullets from reaching it. Behind the group, Michelle stepped back and quietly knelt down, placing one hand flat against the ground. Lena moved toward her in concern. Michelle told her that she had managed to gather a small amount of magical power and thought there might be something she could do with it. An idea had just come to her. Back at the weapon, Koga opened the chamber and announced that he was out of ammunition and needed to reload immediately. As he reached for the ammunition, he pulled his hands back sharply. The barrel and body of the gun were extremely hot from the sustained firing. He explained the problem to the others. Gunpowder generated significant heat with every shot, and the weapon had been heating up steadily. If it overheated completely, they would not be able to fire it anymore. They needed to let it cool, even just for a brief moment. Lena immediately offered her glove to protect his hands during the reload. He thanked her and used it to handle the hot metal as he worked to reload. While they were occupied with the gun, the hydra suddenly drew in a long and deep breath. Ashley watched the movement with narrowing eyes, sensing something familiar about the gesture. Then the creature's central head lifted and a gathering of searing heat and light began building in its mouth. Ashley's eyes went wide with alarm. The hydra unleashed a massive blast of fire directly at the group with a tremendous roar. Rena and Koga froze for a split second, staring at the wall of flame coming toward them. A deafening explosion rocked the entire chamber, and smoke and fire engulfed the space where they stood. As the thick smoke began to clear, a glowing silhouette became visible within it. Michelle had called out a shining wall spell, and a radiant protective barrier had formed around all of them, shielding the group from the worst of the blast. Rena exhaled in overwhelming relief. Ashley and the others called out to Michelle in amazement. Michelle breathed heavily and told them that she had used up every bit of the magical power she had managed to gather, and that she would not be able to block another attack like that. Koga called her name. He looked at her with a warm smile and told her she had done well. Michelle's face lit up at that. Rena thought aloud about the situation. They now knew there was a way to attack the main head, which was something. Koga turned back to the machine gun and confirmed that the reload was complete and he was ready to fire again. Ashley cheered him on. Koga took his position, called the order, and pulled the trigger. Another relentless storm of bullets tore toward the hydra. The rounds ripped through several of the outer heads, which cried out in pain, but the central head remained protected. Someone shouted that the main head was still using the others as cover. Koga roared that he would not let it get away and kept up the fire, flooding the creature with bullets without relenting. But then Michelle called out a new problem. The regeneration rate was speeding up. The hydra was adapting to Koga's attacks just as it had adapted to her magic. Rena added that immediately after finishing regenerating, the outer heads were being repositioned as shields all over again. Then the central head's chest began to glow. Ashley cried out in panic that the creature was preparing another fire attack. Koga declared that they could not afford to give a moment to breathe and continued firing. He spoke as he fired, telling them about the M2 Browning, that it had been in use from 1933 all the way into the 21st century by militaries across his world. Even after countless attempts to redesign or replace it, the fundamental structure of the weapon had never been surpassed. No other machine gun had ever managed to outperform it. He declared with conviction that the M2 Browning would be capable of breaking through the hydra's guard. He continued pouring bullets into the creature. The gun began to smoke heavily from the heat. Rena called out in alarm that at this rate the weapon would be damaged beyond use. Koga refused to stop. He kept firing. The gun hissed and steamed as the heat became extreme, but round after round continued to hammer into the hydra's scales. The outer heads wailed and writhed in agony, twisting under the punishment, and in doing so they shifted, exposing the central head for just a fraction of a moment. A single bullet slipped through the gap. It struck the main head, piercing the thick scales that had protected it until now. More rounds followed immediately, tearing into the exposed weak point without mercy. Then a massive explosion erupted from deep within the creature's core. Rena cried out and shielded her eyes from the force of the blast. Koga slowly released the trigger as smoke rolled across the chamber floor. Behind him, Michelle stood motionless, unable to fully process what she had just witnessed. She thought privately to herself that she could barely believe someone capable of defeating a hydra still existed in this age. She whispered to herself that he was truly remarkable. As the smoke cleared, all that remained of the hydra were scorched bones. Rena stared at them, barely able to speak. Michelle said simply that they had given the creature the beating it deserved. Koga let out a long and slow breath. He observed that the attack had managed to reach the main head in time. He looked at his gun with a quiet smile and thanked it. Then he looked around at the devastation the battle had left behind and remarked that the fight had certainly done significant damage to the surrounding area. Rena replied that what mattered most was that everyone had come through it safely. Ashley agreed completely and started to say that what mattered was that everyone was all right. And then she stopped. The realization hit her all over again. She was still a mouse. She let out a scream of outrage, declaring that things were absolutely not all right because she was still stuck in the body of a small rodent.